In the early summer of 2004, I got a phone call from Steve Jobs. He had been scattershot friendly to me over the years, with occasional bursts of intensity, especially when he was launching a new product that he wanted on the cover of Time or featured on CNN, places where I'd worked. But now that I was no longer at either of those places, I hadn't heard from him much. We talked a bit about the Aspen Institute, which I had recently joined, and I invited him to speak at our summer campus in Colorado. He'd be happy to come, he said, but not to be on stage. He wanted instead to take a walk so that we could talk. That seemed a bit odd. I didn't yet know that taking a long walk was his preferred way to have a serious conversation. It turned out that he wanted me to write a biography of him. I had recently published one on Benjamin Franklin and was writing one about Albert Einstein, and my initial reaction was to wonder, half-jokingly, whether he saw himself as the natural successor in that sequence. Because I assumed that he was still in the middle of an oscillating career that had many more ups and downs left, I demurred. Not now, I said. Maybe in a decade or two, when you retire. I had known him since 1984, when he came to Manhattan to have lunch with Times editors and extol his new Macintosh. He was petulant even then, attacking a Time correspondent for having wounded him with a story that was too revealing. But talking to him afterward, I found myself rather captivated, as so many others have been over the years, by his engaging intensity. We stayed in touch, even after he was ousted from Apple. When he had something to pitch, such as a next computer or Pixar movie, the beam of his charm would suddenly refocus on me, and he would take me to a sushi restaurant in Lower Manhattan to tell me that whatever he was touting was the best thing he had ever produced. I liked him. When he was restored to the throne at Apple, we put him on the cover of Time, and soon thereafter he began offering me his ideas for a series we were doing on the most influential people of the century. He had launched his Think Different campaign, featuring iconic photos of some of the same people we were considering, and he found the endeavor of assessing historic influence fascinating. After I had deflected his suggestion that I write a biography of him, I heard from him every now and then. At one point I emailed to ask if it was true, as my daughter had told me, that the Apple logo was an homage to Alan Turing, the British computer pioneer who broke the German wartime codes and then committed suicide by biting into a cyanide-laced apple. He replied that he wished he had thought of that, but hadn't. That started an exchange about the early history of Apple, and I found myself gathering string on the subject, just in case I ever decided to do such a book. When my Einstein biography came out, he came to a book event in Palo Alto and pulled me aside to suggest, again, that he would make a good subject. His persistence baffled me. He was known to guard his privacy, and I had no reason to believe he'd ever read any of my books. Maybe someday, I continued to say. But in 2009 his wife, Lorene Powell, said bluntly, if you're ever going to do a book on Steve, you'd better do it now. He had just taken a second medical leave. I confessed to her that when he had first raised the idea, I hadn't known he was sick. Almost nobody knew, she said. He had called me right before he was going to be operated on for cancer, and he was still keeping it a secret, she explained. I decided then to write this book. Jobs surprised me by readily acknowledging that he would have no control over it or even the right to see it in advance. It's your book, he said. I won't even read it. But later that fall he seemed to have second thoughts about cooperating and, though I didn't know it, was hit by another round of cancer complications. He stopped returning my calls, and I put the project aside for a while. Then, unexpectedly, he phoned me late on the afternoon of New Year's Eve 2009. He was at home in Palo Alto with only his sister, the writer Mona Simpson. His wife and their 3 children had taken a quick trip to go skiing, but he was not healthy enough to join them. He was in a reflective mood, and we talked for more than an hour. He began by recalling that he had wanted to build a frequency counter when he was 12, and he was able to look up Bill Hewlett, the founder of HP, in the phone book and call him to get parts. Jobs said that the past 12 years of his life, since his return to Apple, had been his most productive in terms of creating new products. But his more important goal, he said, was to do what Hewlett and his friend David Packard had done, which was create a company that was so imbued with innovative creativity that it would outlive them. I always thought of myself as a humanities person as a kid, but I liked electronics, he said. Then I read something that one of my heroes, Edwin Land of Polaroid, said about the importance of people who could stand at the intersection of humanities and sciences, and I decided that's what I wanted to do. It was as if he were suggesting themes for his biography, and in this instance, at least, the theme turned out to be valid. The creativity that can occur when a feel for both the humanities and the sciences combine in one strong personality was the topic that most interested me in my biographies of Franklin and Einstein, and I believe that it will be a key to creating innovative economies in the 21st century. I asked Jobs why he wanted me to be the one to write his biography. "I think you're good at getting people to talk," he replied. That was an unexpected answer. I knew that I would have to interview scores of people he had fired, abused, abandoned, or otherwise infuriated, and I feared he would not be comfortable with my getting them to talk. And indeed he did turn out to be skittish when word trickled back to him of people that I was interviewing. But after a couple of months, he began encouraging people to talk to me, even foes and former girlfriends. Nor did he try to put anything off limits. "I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of, such as getting my girlfriend pregnant when I was 23 and the way I handled that," he said. "But I don't have any skeletons in my closet that can't be allowed out." He didn't seek any control over what I wrote, or even ask to read it in advance. His only involvement came when my publisher was choosing the cover art. When he saw an early version of a proposed cover treatment, he disliked it so much that he asked to have input in designing a new version. I was both amused and willing, so I readily assented. I ended up having more than 40 interviews and conversations with him. Some were formal ones in his Palo Alto living room, others were done during long walks and drives or by telephone. During my 2 years of visits, he became increasingly intimate and revealing, though at times I witnessed what his veteran colleagues at Apple used to call his reality distortion field. Sometimes it was the inadvertent misfiring of memory cells that happens to us all. At other times he was spinning his own version of reality both to me and to himself. To check and flesh out his story, I interviewed more than 100 friends, relatives, competitors, adversaries, and colleagues. His wife also did not request any restrictions or control, nor did she ask to see in advance what I would publish. In fact, she strongly encouraged me to be honest about his failings as well as his strengths. She is one of the smartest and most grounded people I have ever met. There are parts of his life and personality that are extremely messy, and that's the truth, she told me early on. You shouldn't whitewash it. He's good at spin, but he also has a remarkable story, and I'd like to see that it's all told truthfully. I leave it to the reader to assess whether I have succeeded in this mission. I'm sure there are players in this drama who will remember some of the events differently or think that I sometimes got trapped in Jobs' distortion field. As happened when I wrote a book about Henry Kissinger, which in some ways was good preparation for this project, I found that people had such strong positive and negative emotions about Jobs that the Rashomon effect was often evident. But I've done the best I can to balance conflicting accounts fairly and be transparent about the sources I used. This is a book about the roller coaster life and searingly intense personality of a creative entrepreneur whose passion for perfection and ferocious drive revolutionized 6 industries: personal computers, animated movies, music, phones, tablet computing, and digital publishing. You might even add a 7th, retail stores, which Jobs did not quite revolutionize but did reimagine. In addition, he opened the way for a new market for digital content based on apps rather than just websites. Along the way he produced not only transforming products but also, on his second try, a lasting company, endowed with his DNA, that is filled with creative designers and daredevil engineers who could carry forward his vision. In August 2011, right before he stepped down as CEO, the enterprise he started in his parents' garage became the world's most valuable company. This is also, I hope, a book about innovation. At a time when the United States is seeking ways to sustain its innovative edge, and when societies around the world are trying to build creative digital age economies, Jobs stands as the ultimate icon of inventiveness, imagination, and sustained innovation. He knew that the best way to create value in the 21st century was to connect creativity with technology, so he built a company where leaps of the imagination were combined with remarkable feats of engineering. He and his colleagues at Apple were able to think differently. They developed not merely modest product advances based on focus groups, but whole new devices and services that consumers did not yet know they needed. He was not a model boss or human being, tidily packaged for emulation. Driven by demons, he could drive those around him to fury and despair. But his personality and passions and products were all interrelated, just as Apple's hardware and software tended to be, as if part of an integrated system. His tale is thus both instructive and cautionary, filled with lessons about innovation, character, leadership, and values. Shakespeare's Henry V, the story of a willful and immature prince who becomes a passionate but sensitive, callous but sentimental, inspiring but flawed king, begins with the exhortation, "Oh for a muse of fire, that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention." For Steve Jobs, the ascent to the brightest heaven of invention begins with a tale of two sets of parents, and of growing up in a valley that was just learning how to turn silicon into gold. Steve Jobs, Paul Jobs with Steve, 1956. The Los Altos house with the garage where Apple was born in the Homestead High Yearbook, 1972 with the "Suave Job" school prank sign. Chapter 1. Childhood abandoned and chosen. The adoption. When Paul Jobs was mustered out of the Coast Guard after World War II, he made a wager with his crewmates. They had arrived in San Francisco, where their ship was decommissioned, and Paul bet that he would find himself a wife within 2 weeks. He was a taut, tattooed engine mechanic, 6 feet tall, with a passing resemblance to James Dean. But it wasn't his looks that got him a date with Clara Hagopian, a sweet-humored daughter of Armenian immigrants. It was the fact that he and his friends had a car, unlike the group she had originally planned to go out with that evening. 10 days later, in March 1946, Paul got engaged to Clara and won his wager. It would turn out to be a happy marriage, one that lasted until death parted them more than 40 years later. Paul Reinhold Jobs had been raised on a dairy farm in Germantown, Wisconsin. Even though his father was an alcoholic and sometimes abusive, Paul ended up with a gentle and calm disposition under his leathery exterior. After dropping out of high school, he wandered through the Midwest picking up work as a mechanic until, at age 19, he joined the Coast Guard, even though he didn't know how to swim. He was deployed on the USS General M.C. Meigs and spent much of the war ferrying troops to Italy for General Patton. His talent as a machinist and fireman earned him commendations, but he occasionally found himself in minor trouble and never rose above the rank of seaman. Clara was born in New Jersey, where her parents had landed after fleeing the Turks in Armenia, and they moved to the Mission District of San Francisco when she was a child. She had a secret that she rarely mentioned to anyone. She had been married before, but her husband had been killed in the war. So when she met Paul Jobs on that first date, she was primed to start a new life. Like many who lived through the war, they had experienced enough excitement that, when it was over, they desired simply to settle down, raise a family, and lead a less eventful life. They had little money, so they moved to Wisconsin and lived with Paul's parents for a few years, then headed for Indiana, where he got a job as a machinist for International Harvester. His passion was tinkering with old cars, and he made money in his spare time buying, restoring, and selling them. Eventually he quit his day job to become a full-time used car salesman. Clara, however, loved San Francisco, and in 1952 she convinced her husband to move back there. They got an apartment in the Sunset District facing the Pacific, just south of Golden Gate Park, and he took a job working for a finance company as a repo man, picking the locks of cars whose owners hadn't paid their loans and repossessing them. He also bought, repaired, and sold some of the cars, making a decent enough living in the process. There was, however, something missing in their lives. They wanted children, but Clara had suffered an ectopic pregnancy, in which the fertilized egg was implanted in a fallopian tube rather than the uterus, and she had been unable to have any. So by 1955, after 9 years of marriage, they were looking to adopt a child. Like Paul Jobs, Joanne Schiebel was from a rural Wisconsin family of German heritage. Her father, Arthur Schiebel, had immigrated to the outskirts of Green Bay, where he and his wife owned a mink farm and dabbled successfully in various other businesses, including real estate and photoengraving. He was very strict, especially regarding his daughter's relationships, and he had strongly disapproved of her first love, an artist who was not a Catholic. Thus it was no surprise that he threatened to cut Joanne off completely when, as a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, she fell in love with Abdulfatah John Jandali, a Muslim teaching assistant from Syria. Jandali was the youngest of 9 children in a prominent Syrian family. His father owned oil refineries and multiple other businesses, with large holdings in Damascus and Homs, and at one point pretty much controlled the price of wheat in the region. His mother, he later said, was a traditional Muslim woman, who was a conservative, obedient housewife. Like the Scheibel family, the Jandalis put a premium on education. Abdulfatah was sent to a Jesuit boarding school, even though he was Muslim, and he got an undergraduate degree at the American University in Beirut before entering the University of Wisconsin to pursue a doctoral degree in political science. In the summer of 1954, Joanne went with Abdulfatah to Syria. They spent 2 months in Homs, where she learned from his family to cook Syrian dishes. When they returned to Wisconsin, she discovered that she was pregnant. They were both 23, but they decided not to get married. Her father was dying at the time, and he had threatened to disown her if she wed Abdulfatah. Nor was abortion an easy option in a small Catholic community. So in early 1955, Joanne traveled to San Francisco, where she was taken into the care of a kindly doctor who sheltered unwed mothers, delivered their babies, and quietly arranged closed adoptions. Joanne had one requirement: her child must be adopted by college graduates. So the doctor arranged for the baby to be placed with a lawyer and his wife. But when a boy was born, on February 24, 1955, the designated couple decided that they wanted a girl and backed out. Thus it was that the boy became the son not of a lawyer but of a high school dropout with a passion for mechanics and his salt-of-the-earth wife who was working as a bookkeeper. Paul and Clara named their new baby Stephen Paul Jobs. When Joanne found out that her baby had been placed with a couple who had not even graduated from high school, she refused to sign the adoption papers. The standoff lasted weeks, even after the baby had settled into the Jobs household. Eventually Joanne relented, with the stipulation that the couple promise, indeed sign a pledge, to fund a savings account to pay for the boy's college education. There was another reason that Joanne was balky about signing the adoption papers. Her father was about to die, and she planned to marry Jandali soon after. She held out hope, she would later tell family members, sometimes tearing up at the memory, that once they were married, she could get their baby boy back. Arthur Scheibel died in August 1955, after the adoption was finalized. Just after Christmas that year, Joanne and Abdulfatah were married in St. Philip the Apostle Catholic Church in Green Bay. He got his Ph.D. in international politics the next year, and then they had another child, a girl named Mona. After she and Jandali divorced in 1962, Joanne embarked on a dreamy and peripatetic life that her daughter, who grew up to become the acclaimed novelist Mona Simpson, would capture in her book Anywhere But Here. Because Steve's adoption had been closed, it would be 20 years before they would all find each other. Steve Jobs knew from an early age that he was adopted. My parents were very open with me about that, he recalled. He had a vivid memory of sitting on the lawn of his house, when he was 6 or 7 years old, telling the girl who lived across the street. So does that mean your real parents didn't want you? The girl asked. Lightning bolts went off in my head, according to Jobs. I remember running into the house, crying. And my parents said, no, you have to understand. They were very serious and looked me straight in the eye. They said, we specifically picked you out. Both of my parents said that and repeated it slowly for me. And they put an emphasis on every word in that sentence. Abandoned. Chosen. Special. Those concepts became part of who Jobs was and how he regarded himself. His closest friends think that the knowledge that he was given up at birth left some scars. I think his desire for complete control of whatever he makes derives directly from his personality and the fact that he was abandoned at birth, said one longtime colleague, Del Yoakum. He wants to control his environment, and he sees the product as an extension of himself. Greg Calhoun, who became close to Jobs right after college, saw another effect. Steve talked to me a lot about being abandoned and the pain that caused, he said. It made him independent. He followed the beat of a different drummer, and that came from being in a different world than he was born into. Later in life, when he was the same age his biological father had been when he abandoned him, Jobs would father and abandon a child of his own. He eventually took responsibility for her. Chrisanne Brennan, the mother of that child, said that being put up for adoption left Jobs full of broken glass, and it helps to explain some of his behavior. He who is abandoned is an abandoner, she said. Andy Hertzfeld, who worked with Jobs at Apple in the early 1980s, is among the few who remained close to both Brennan and Jobs. The key question about Steve is why he can't control himself at times from being so reflexively cruel and harmful to some people, he said. That goes back to being abandoned at birth. The real underlying problem was the theme of abandonment in Steve's life. Jobs dismissed this. There's some notion that because I was abandoned, I worked very hard so I could do well and make my parents wish they had me back, or some such nonsense, but that's ridiculous, he insisted. Knowing I was adopted may have made me feel more independent, but I have never felt abandoned. I've always felt special. My parents made me feel special. He would later bristle whenever anyone referred to Paul and Clara Jobs as his adoptive parents or implied that they were not his real parents. They were my parents 1000%, he said. When speaking about his biological parents, on the other hand, he was curt. They were my sperm and egg bank. That's not harsh, it's just the way it was, a sperm bank thing, nothing more. Silicon Valley. The childhood that Paul and Clara Jobs created for their new son was, in many ways, a stereotype of the late 1950s. When Steve was 2 they adopted a girl they named Patty, and 3 years later they moved to a tract house in the suburbs. The finance company where Paul worked as a repo man, CIT, had transferred him down to its Palo Alto office, but he could not afford to live there, so they landed in a subdivision in Mountain View, a less expensive town just to the south. There Paul tried to pass along his love of mechanics and cars. "Steve, this is your workbench now," he said as he marked off a section of the table in their garage. Jobs remembered being impressed by his father's focus on craftsmanship. "I thought my dad's sense of design was pretty good," he said, because he knew how to build anything. If we needed a cabinet, he would build it. When he built our fence, he gave me a hammer so I could work with him. 50 years later the fence still surrounds the back and side yards of the house in Mountain View. As Jobs showed it off to me, he caressed the stockade panels and recalled a lesson that his father implanted deeply in him. It was important, his father said, to craft the backs of cabinets and fences properly, even though they were hidden. He loved doing things right. He even cared about the look of the parts you couldn't see. His father continued to refurbish and resell used cars, and he festooned the garage with pictures of his favorites. He would point out the detailing of the design to his son, the lines, the vents, the chrome, the trim of the seats. After work each day, he would change into his dungarees and retreat to the garage, often with Steve tagging along. I figured I could get him nailed down with a little mechanical ability, but he really wasn't interested in getting his hands dirty, Paul later recalled. He never really cared too much about mechanical things. I wasn't that into fixing cars, Jobs admitted. But I was eager to hang out with my dad. Even as he was growing more aware that he had been adopted, he was becoming more attached to his father. One day when he was about 8, he discovered a photograph of his father from his time in the Coast Guard. He's in the engine room, and he's got his shirt off and looks like James Dean. It was one of those oh wow moments for a kid. Wow, ooh, my parents were actually once very young and really good looking. Through cars, his father gave Steve his first exposure to electronics. My dad did not have a deep understanding of electronics, but he'd encountered it a lot in automobiles and other things he would fix. He showed me the rudiments of electronics, and I got very interested in that. Even more interesting were the trips to scavenge for parts. Every weekend, there'd be a junkyard trip. We'd be looking for a generator, a carburetor, all sorts of components. He remembered watching his father negotiate at the counter. He was a good bargainer, because he knew better than the guys at the counter what the parts should cost. This helped fulfill the pledge his parents made when he was adopted. My college fund came from my dad paying $50 for a Ford Falcon or some other beat-up car that didn't run, working on it for a few weeks, and selling it for $250, and not telling the IRS. The Jobses' house and the others in their neighborhood were built by the real estate developer Joseph Eichler, whose company spawned more than 11,000 homes in various California subdivisions between 1950 and 1974. Inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright's vision of simple modern homes for the American everyman, Eichler built inexpensive houses that featured floor-to-ceiling glass walls, open floor plans, exposed post and beam construction, concrete slab floors, and lots of sliding glass doors. Eichler did a great thing, Jobs said on one of our walks around the neighborhood. His houses were smart and cheap and good. They brought clean design and simple taste to lower-income people. They had awesome little features, like radiant heating in the floors. You put carpet on them, and we had nice toasty floors when we were kids. Jobs said that his appreciation for Eichler homes instilled in him a passion for making nicely designed products for the mass market. I love it when you can bring really great design and simple capability to something that doesn't cost much, he said as he pointed out the clean elegance of the houses. It was the original vision for Apple. That's what we tried to do with the first Mac. That's what we did with the iPod. Across the street from the Jobs family lived a man who had become successful as a real estate agent. He wasn't that bright, Jobs recalled, but he seemed to be making a fortune. So my dad thought, I can do that. He worked so hard, I remember. He took these night classes, passed the license test, and got into real estate. Then the bottom fell out of the market. As a result, the family found itself financially strapped for a year or so while Steve was in elementary school. His mother took a job as a bookkeeper for Varian Associates, a company that made scientific instruments, and they took out a second mortgage. One day his fourth-grade teacher asked him, "What is it you don't understand about the universe?" Jobs replied, "I don't understand why all of a sudden my dad is so broke." He was proud that his father never adopted a servile attitude or slick style that may have made him a better salesman. You had to suck up to people to sell real estate, and he wasn't good at that and it wasn't in his nature. I admired him for that. Paul Jobs went back to being a mechanic. His father was calm and gentle, traits that his son later praised more than emulated. He was also resolute. Jobs described one example. Nearby was an engineer who was working at Westinghouse. He was a single guy, beatnik type. He had a girlfriend. She would babysit me sometimes. Both my parents worked, so I would come here right after school for a couple of hours. He would get drunk and hit her a couple of times. She came over one night, scared out of her wits, and he came over drunk, and my dad stood him down, saying, "She's here, but you're not coming in." He stood right there. We like to think everything was idyllic in the 1950s, but this guy was one of those engineers who had messed up lives. What made the neighborhood different from the thousands of other spindly tree subdivisions across America was that even the ne'er-do-wells tended to be engineers. When we moved here, there were apricot and plum orchards on all of these corners, Jobs recalled. But it was beginning to boom because of military investment. He soaked up the history of the valley and developed a yearning to play his own role. Edwin Land of Polaroid later told him about being asked by Eisenhower to help build the U-2 spy plane cameras to see how real the Soviet threat was. The film was dropped in canisters and returned to the NASA Ames Research Center in Sunnyvale, not far from where Jobs lived. The first computer terminal I ever saw was when my dad brought me to the Ames Center, he said. I fell totally in love with it. Other defense contractors sprouted nearby during the 1950s. The Lockheed Missiles and Space Division, which built submarine-launched ballistic missiles, was founded in 1956 next to the NASA Center. By the time Jobs moved to the area 4 years later, it employed 20,000 people. A few hundred yards away, Westinghouse built facilities that produced tubes and electrical transformers for the missile systems. You had all these military companies on the cutting edge, he recalled. It was mysterious and high-tech and made living here very exciting. In the wake of the defense industries there arose a booming economy based on technology. Its roots stretched back to 1938, when David Packard and his new wife moved into a house in Palo Alto that had a shed where his friend Bill Hewlett was soon ensconced. The house had a garage, an appendage that would prove both useful and iconic in the valley, in which they tinkered around until they had their first product, an audio oscillator. By the 1950s, Hewlett-Packard was a fast-growing company making technical instruments. Fortunately there was a place nearby for entrepreneurs who had outgrown their garages. In a move that would help transform the area into the cradle of the tech revolution, Stanford University's Dean of Engineering, Frederick Terman, created a 700-acre industrial park on university land for private companies that could commercialize the ideas of his students. Its first tenant was Varian Associates, where Clara Jobs worked. Terman came up with this great idea that did more than anything to cause the tech industry to grow up here, Jobs said. By the time Jobs was 10, HP had 9,000 employees and was the blue-chip company where every engineer seeking financial stability wanted to work. The most important technology for the region's growth was, of course, the semiconductor. William Shockley, who had been one of the inventors of the transistor at Bell Labs in New Jersey, moved out to Mountain View and, in 1956, started a company to build transistors using silicon rather than the more expensive germanium that was then commonly used. But Shockley became increasingly erratic and abandoned his silicon transistor project, which led 8 of his engineers, most notably Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, to break away to form Fairchild Semiconductor. That company grew to 12,000 employees, but it fragmented in 1968, when Noyce lost a power struggle to become CEO. He took Gordon Moore and founded a company that they called Integrated Electronics Corporation, which they soon smartly abbreviated to Intel. Their third employee was Andrew Grove, who later would grow the company by shifting its focus from memory chips to microprocessors. Within a few years there would be more than 50 companies in the area making semiconductors. The exponential growth of this industry was correlated with the phenomenon famously discovered by Moore, who in 1965 drew a graph of the speed of integrated circuits, based on the number of transistors that could be placed on a chip, and showed that it doubled about every 2 years, a trajectory that could be expected to continue. This was reaffirmed in 1971, when Intel was able to etch a complete central processing unit onto one chip, the Intel 4004, which was dubbed a microprocessor. Moore's law has held generally true to this day, and its reliable projection of performance to price allowed 2 generations of young entrepreneurs, including Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, to create cost projections for their forward-leaning products. The chip industry gave the region a new name when Don Hoefler, a columnist for the weekly trade paper Electronic News, began a series in January 1971 entitled, Silicon Valley USA. The 40-mile Santa Clara Valley, which stretches from South San Francisco through Palo Alto to San Jose, has as its commercial backbone El Camino Real, the royal road that once connected California's 21 mission churches and is now a bustling avenue that connects companies and startups accounting for a third of the venture capital investment in the United States each year. Growing up, I got inspired by the history of the place, Jobs said. That made me want to be a part of it. Like most kids, he became infused with the passions of the grown-ups around him. Most of the dads in the neighborhood did really neat stuff, like photovoltaics and batteries and radar, Jobs recalled. I grew up in awe of that stuff and asking people about it. The most important of these neighbors, Larry Lang, lived 7 doors away. He was my model of what an HP engineer was supposed to be, a big ham radio operator, hardcore electronics guy, Jobs recalled. He would bring me stuff to play with. As we walked up to Lang's old house, Jobs pointed to the driveway. He took a carbon microphone and a battery and a speaker, and he put it on this driveway. He had me talk into the carbon mic and it amplified out of the speaker. Jobs had been taught by his father that microphones always required an electronic amplifier. So I raced home, and I told my dad that he was wrong. No, it needs an amplifier, his father assured him. When Steve protested otherwise, his father said he was crazy. It can't work without an amplifier. There's some trick. I kept saying no to my dad, telling him he had to see it, and finally he actually walked down with me and saw it. And he said, well, I'll be a bat out of hell. Jobs recalled the incident vividly because it was his first realization that his father did not know everything. Then a more disconcerting discovery began to dawn on him. He was smarter than his parents. He had always admired his father's competence and savvy. He was not an educated man, but I had always thought he was pretty damn smart. He didn't read much, but he could do a lot. Almost everything mechanical, he could figure it out. Yet the carbon microphone incident, Jobs said, began a jarring process of realizing that he was in fact more clever and quick than his parents. It was a very big moment that's burned into my mind. When I realized that I was smarter than my parents, I felt tremendous shame for having thought that. I will never forget that moment. This discovery, he later told friends, along with the fact that he was adopted, made him feel apart, detached and separate, from both his family and the world. Another layer of awareness occurred soon after. Not only did he discover that he was brighter than his parents, but he discovered that they knew this. Paul and Clara Jobs were loving parents, and they were willing to adapt their lives to suit a son who was very smart, and also willful. They would go to great lengths to accommodate him. And soon Steve discovered this fact as well. Both my parents got me. They felt a lot of responsibility once they sensed that I was special. They found ways to keep feeding me stuff and putting me in better schools. They were willing to defer to my needs. So he grew up not only with a sense of having once been abandoned, but also with a sense that he was special. In his own mind, that was more important in the formation of his personality. School. Even before Jobs started elementary school, his mother had taught him how to read. This, however, led to some problems once he got to school. I was kind of bored for the first few years, so I occupied myself by getting into trouble. It also soon became clear that Jobs, by both nature and nurture, was not disposed to accept authority. I encountered authority of a different kind than I had ever encountered before, and I did not like it. And they really almost got me. They came close to really beating any curiosity out of me. His school, Monte Loma Elementary, was a series of low-slung 1950s buildings 4 blocks from his house. He countered his boredom by playing pranks. I had a good friend named Rick Ferentino, and we'd get into all sorts of trouble, he recalled. Like we made little posters announcing, "Bring your pet to school day." It was crazy, with dogs chasing cats all over, and the teachers were beside themselves. Another time they convinced some kids to tell them the combination numbers for their bike locks. Then we went outside and switched all of the locks, and nobody could get their bikes. It took them until late that night to straighten things out. When he was in 3rd grade, the pranks became a bit more dangerous. One time we set off an explosive under the chair of our teacher, Mrs. Thurman. We gave her a nervous twitch. Not surprisingly, he was sent home 2 or 3 times before he finished 3rd grade. By then, however, his father had begun to treat him as special, and in his calm but firm manner he made it clear that he expected the school to do the same. "Look, it's not his fault," Paul Jobs told the teachers, his son recalled. "If you can't keep him interested, it's your fault." His parents never punished him for his transgressions at school. "My father's father was an alcoholic and whipped him with a belt, but I'm not sure if I ever got spanked." Both of his parents, he added, knew the school was at fault for trying to make me memorize stupid stuff rather than stimulating me. He was already starting to show the admixture of sensitivity and insensitivity, bristliness and detachment, that would mark him for the rest of his life. When it came time for him to go into 4th grade, the school decided it was best to put Jobs and Ferentino into separate classes. The teacher for the advanced class was a spunky woman named Imogene Hill, known as Teddy, and she became, Jobs said, one of the saints of my life. After watching him for a couple of weeks, she figured that the best way to handle him was to bribe him. After school one day, she gave me this workbook with math problems in it, and she said, "I want you to take it home and do this." And I thought, "Are you nuts?" And then she pulled out one of these giant lollipops that seemed as big as the world. And she said, "When you're done with it, if you get it mostly right, I will give you this and $5. And I handed it back within 2 days. After a few months, he no longer required the bribes. I just wanted to learn and to please her. She reciprocated by getting him a hobby kit for grinding a lens and making a camera. I learned more from her than any other teacher, and if it hadn't been for her I'm sure I would have gone to jail. It reinforced, once again, the idea that he was special. In my class, it was just me she cared about. She saw something in me. It was not merely intelligence that she saw. Years later she liked to show off a picture of that year's class on Hawaii Day. Jobs had shown up without the suggested Hawaiian shirt, but in the picture he is front and center wearing one. He had, literally, been able to talk the shirt off another kid's back. Near the end of 4th grade, Mrs. Hill had Jobs tested. "I scored at the high school sophomore level," he recalled. Now that it was clear, not only to himself and his parents but also to his teachers, that he was intellectually special, the school made the remarkable proposal that he skip 2 grades and go right into 7th. It would be the easiest way to keep him challenged and stimulated. His parents decided, more sensibly, to have him skip only 1 grade. The transition was wrenching. He was a socially awkward loner who found himself with kids a year older. Worse yet, the 6th grade was in a different school, Crittenden Middle. It was only 8 blocks from Monte Loma Elementary, but in many ways it was a world apart, located in a neighborhood filled with ethnic gangs. Fights were a daily occurrence, as were shakedowns in bathrooms, wrote the Silicon Valley journalist Michael S. Malone. Knives were regularly brought to school as a show of macho. Around the time that Jobs arrived, a group of students were jailed for a gang rape, and the bus of a neighboring school was destroyed after its team beat Crittenden's in a wrestling match. Jobs was often bullied, and in the middle of 7th grade he gave his parents an ultimatum. I insisted they put me in a different school, he recalled. Financially this was a tough demand. His parents were barely making ends meet, but by this point there was little doubt that they would eventually bend to his will. When they resisted, I told them I would just quit going to school if I had to go back to Crittenden. So they researched where the best schools were and scraped together every dime and bought a house for $21,000 in a nicer district. The move was only 3 miles to the south, to a former apricot orchard in Los Altos that had been turned into a subdivision of cookie-cutter tract homes. Their house, at 2066 Crist Drive, was 1 story with 3 bedrooms and an all-important attached garage with a roll-down door facing the street. There Paul Jobs could tinker with cars and his son with electronics. Its other significant attribute was that it was just over the line inside what was then the Cupertino-Sunnyvale School District, one of the safest and best in the valley. When I moved here, these corners were still orchards, Jobs pointed out as we walked in front of his old house. The guy who lived right there taught me how to be a good organic gardener and to compost. He grew everything to perfection. I never had better food in my life. That's when I began to appreciate organic fruits and vegetables. Even though they were not fervent about their faith, Jobs's parents wanted him to have a religious upbringing, so they took him to the Lutheran church most Sundays. That came to an end when he was 13. In July 1968 Life magazine published a shocking cover showing a pair of starving children in Biafra. Jobs took it to Sunday school and confronted the church's pastor. If I raise my finger, will God know which one I'm going to raise even before I do it? The pastor answered, yes, God knows everything. Jobs then pulled out the Life cover and asked, well, does God know about this and what's going to happen to those children? Steve, I know you don't understand, but yes, God knows about that. Jobs announced that he didn't want to have anything to do with worshiping such a God, and he never went back to church. He did, however, spend years studying and trying to practice the tenets of Zen Buddhism. Reflecting years later on his spiritual feelings, he said that religion was at its best when it emphasized spiritual experiences rather than received dogma. The juice goes out of Christianity when it becomes too based on faith rather than on living like Jesus or seeing the world as Jesus saw it, he told me. I think different religions are different doors to the same house. Sometimes I think the house exists, and sometimes I don't. It's the great mystery. Paul Jobs was then working at Spectra Physics, a company in nearby Santa Clara that made lasers for electronics and medical products. As a machinist, he crafted the prototypes of products that the engineers were devising. His son was fascinated by the need for perfection. Lasers require precision alignment, Jobs said. The really sophisticated ones, for airborne applications or medical, had very precise features. They would tell my dad something like, this is what we want, and we want it out of one piece of metal so that the coefficients of expansion are all the same. And he had to figure out how to do it. Most pieces had to be made from scratch, which meant that Paul had to create custom tools and dies. His son was impressed, but he rarely went to the machine shop. It would have been fun if he had gotten to teach me how to use a mill and lathe. But unfortunately I never went, because I was more interested in electronics. One summer Paul took Steve to Wisconsin to visit the family's dairy farm. Rural life did not appeal to Steve, but one image stuck with him. He saw a calf being born, and he was amazed when the tiny animal struggled up within minutes and began to walk. It was not something she had learned, but it was instead hardwired into her, he recalled. A human baby couldn't do that. I found it remarkable, even though no one else did. He put it in hardware-software terms. It was as if something in the animal's body and in its brain had been engineered to work together instantly rather than being learned. In 9th grade Jobs went to Homestead High, which had a sprawling campus of 2-story cinderblock buildings painted pink that served 2,000 students. It was designed by a famous prison architect, Jobs recalled. They wanted to make it indestructible. He had developed a love of walking, and he walked the 15 blocks to school by himself each day. He had few friends his own age, but he got to know some seniors who were immersed in the counterculture of the late 1960s. It was a time when the geek and hippie worlds were beginning to show some overlap. My friends were the really smart kids, he said. I was interested in math and science and electronics. They were too, and also into LSD and the whole counterculture trip. His pranks by then typically involved electronics. At one point he wired his house with speakers. But since speakers can also be used as microphones, he built a control room in his closet, where he could listen in on what was happening in other rooms. One night, when he had his headphones on and was listening in on his parents' bedroom, his father caught him and angrily demanded that he dismantle the system. He spent many evenings visiting the garage of Larry Lang, the engineer who lived down the street from his old house. Lang eventually gave Jobs the carbon microphone that had fascinated him, and he turned him onto Heath-kits, those assemble-it-yourself kits for making ham radios and other electronic gear that were beloved by the soldering set back then. Heath-kits came with all the boards and parts color-coded, but the manual also explained the theory of how it operated, Jobs recalled. It made you realize you could build and understand anything. Once you built a couple of radios, you'd see a TV in the catalog and say, I can build that as well, even if you didn't. I was very lucky, because when I was a kid both my dad and the Heath-kits made me believe I could build anything. Lang also got him into the Hewlett-Packard Explorers Club, a group of 15 or so students who met in the company cafeteria on Tuesday nights. They would get an engineer from one of the labs to come and talk about what he was working on, Jobs recalled. My dad would drive me there. I was in heaven. HP was a pioneer of light-emitting diodes. So we talked about what to do with them. Because his father now worked for a laser company, that topic particularly interested him. One night he cornered one of HP's laser engineers after a talk and got a tour of the holography lab. But the most lasting impression came from seeing the small computers the company was developing. I saw my first desktop computer there. It was called the 9100A, and it was a glorified calculator but also really the first desktop computer. It was huge, maybe 40 pounds, but it was a beauty of a thing. I fell in love with it. The kids in the Explorers Club were encouraged to do projects, and Jobs decided to build a frequency counter, which measures the number of pulses per second in an electronic signal. He needed some parts that HP made, so he picked up the phone and called the CEO. Back then, people didn't have unlisted numbers. So I looked up Bill Hewlett in Palo Alto and called him at home. And he answered and chatted with me for 20 minutes. He got me the parts, but he also got me a job in the plant where they made frequency counters. Jobs worked there the summer after his freshman year at Homestead High. My dad would drive me in the morning and pick me up in the evening. His work mainly consisted of just putting nuts and bolts on things, on an assembly line. There was some resentment among his fellow line workers toward the pushy kid who had talked his way in by calling the CEO. I remember telling one of the supervisors, I love this stuff, and then I asked him what he liked to do best. And he said, to fuck. Jobs had an easier time ingratiating himself with the engineers who worked one floor above. They served donuts and coffee every morning at 10. So I'd go upstairs and hang out with them. Jobs liked to work. He also had a newspaper route. His father would drive him when it was raining, and during his sophomore year spent weekends and the summer as a stock clerk at a cavernous electronics store, Haltech. It was to electronics what his father's junkyards were to auto parts, a scavenger's paradise sprawling over an entire city block with new, used, salvaged, and surplus components crammed onto warrens of shelves, dumped unsorted into bins, and piled in an outdoor yard. Out in the back, near the bay, they had a fenced-in area with things like Polaris submarine interiors that had been ripped and sold for salvage, he recalled. All the controls and buttons were right there. The colors were military greens and grays, but they had these switches and bulb covers of amber and red. There were these big old lever switches that, when you flipped them, it was awesome, like you were blowing up Chicago. At the wooden counters up front, laden with thick catalogs in tattered binders, people would haggle for switches, resistors, capacitors, and sometimes the latest memory chips. His father used to do that for auto parts, and he succeeded because he knew the value of each better than the clerks. Jobs followed suit. He developed a knowledge of electronic parts that was honed by his love of negotiating and turning a profit. He would go to electronic flea markets, such as the San Jose Swap Meet, haggle for a used circuit board that contained some valuable chips or components, and then sell those to his manager at Haltech. Jobs was able to get his first car, with his father's help, when he was 15. It was a two-tone Nash Metropolitan that his father had fitted out with an MG engine. Jobs didn't really like it, but he did not want to tell his father that, or miss out on the chance to have his own car. In retrospect, a Nash Metropolitan might seem like the most wickedly cool car, he later said. But at the time it was the most uncool car in the world. Still, it was a car, so that was great. Within a year he had saved up enough from his various jobs that he could trade up to a red Fiat 850 coupe with an Abarth engine. My dad helped me buy and inspect it. The satisfaction of getting paid and saving up for something, that was very exciting. That same summer, between his sophomore and junior years at Homestead, Jobs began smoking marijuana. I got stoned for the first time that summer. I was 15, and then began using pot regularly. At one point his father found some dope in his son's Fiat. "What's this?" he asked. Jobs coolly replied, "That's marijuana." It was one of the few times in his life that he faced his father's anger. "That was the only real fight I ever got in with my dad," he said. But his father again bent to his will. He wanted me to promise that I'd never use pot again, but I wouldn't promise. In fact, by his senior year he was also dabbling in LSD and hash as well as exploring the mind-bending effects of sleep deprivation. I was starting to get stoned a bit more. We would also drop acid occasionally, usually in fields or in cars. He also flowered intellectually during his last 2 years in high school and found himself at the intersection, as he had begun to see it, of those who were geekily immersed in electronics and those who were into literature and creative endeavors. I started to listen to music a whole lot, and I started to read more outside of just science and technology, Shakespeare, Plato. I loved King Lear. His other favorites included Moby Dick and the poems of Dylan Thomas. I asked him why he related to King Lear and Captain Ahab, two of the most willful and driven characters in literature, but he didn't respond to the connection I was making, so I let it drop. When I was a senior I had this phenomenal AP English class. The teacher was this guy who looked like Ernest Hemingway. He took a bunch of us snowshoeing in Yosemite. One course that Jobs took would become part of Silicon Valley lore, the electronics class taught by John McCollum, a former Navy pilot who had a showman's flair for exciting his students with such tricks as firing up a Tesla coil. His little stockroom, to which he would lend the key to pet students, was crammed with transistors and other components he had scored. McCollum's classroom was in a shed-like building on the edge of the campus, next to the parking lot. "This is where it was," Jobs recalled as he peered in the window, "and here, next door, is where the auto shop class used to be." The juxtaposition highlighted the shift from the interests of his father's generation. Mr. McCollum felt that electronics class was the new auto shop. McCollum believed in military discipline and respect for authority. Jobs didn't. His aversion to authority was something he no longer tried to hide, and he affected an attitude that combined wiry and weird intensity with aloof rebelliousness. McCollum later said, "He was usually off in a corner doing something on his own and really didn't want to have much of anything to do with either me or the rest of the class." He never trusted Jobs with a key to the stockroom. One day Jobs needed a part that was not available, so he made a collect call to the manufacturer, Burroughs in Detroit, and said he was designing a new product and wanted to test out the part. It arrived by air freight a few days later. When McCollum asked how he had gotten it, Jobs described, with defiant pride, the collect call and the tale he had told. "I was furious," McCollum said. "That was not the way I wanted my students to behave." Jobs's response was, "I don't have the money for the phone call. They've got plenty of money." Jobs took McCollum's class for only 1 year, rather than the 3 that it was offered. For one of his projects, he made a device with a photocell that would switch on a circuit when exposed to light, something any high school science student could have done. He was far more interested in playing with lasers, something he learned from his father. With a few friends, he created light shows for parties by bouncing lasers off mirrors that were attached to the speakers of his stereo system. Chapter 2 Odd Couple The two Steves Jobs and Wozniak in the Garage, 1976 While a student in McCollum's class, Jobs became friends with a graduate who was the teacher's all-time favorite and a school legend for his wizardry in the class. Stephen Wozniak, whose younger brother had been on a swim team with Jobs, was almost 5 years older than Jobs and far more knowledgeable about electronics. But emotionally and socially he was still a high school geek. Like Jobs, Wozniak learned a lot at his father's knee. But their lessons were different. Paul Jobs was a high school dropout who, when fixing up cars, knew how to turn a tidy profit by striking the right deal on parts. Francis Wozniak, known as Jerry, was a brilliant engineering graduate from Caltech, where he had quarterbacked the football team, who became a rocket scientist at Lockheed. He exalted engineering and looked down on those in business, marketing, and sales. I remember him telling me that engineering was the highest level of importance you could reach in the world, Steve Wozniak later recalled. It takes society to a new level. One of Steve Wozniak's first memories was going to his father's workplace on a weekend and being shown electronic parts, with his dad, putting them on a table with me so I got to play with them. He watched with fascination as his father tried to get a waveform line on a video screen to stay flat so he could show that one of his circuit designs was working properly. I could see that whatever my dad was doing, it was important and good. Woz, as he was known even then, would ask about the resistors and transistors lying around the house, and his father would pull out a blackboard to illustrate what they did. He would explain what a resistor was by going all the way back to atoms and electrons. He explained how resistors worked when I was in second grade, not by equations but by having me picture it. Woz's father taught him something else that became ingrained in his childlike, socially awkward personality: never lie. My dad believed in honesty. Extreme honesty. That's the biggest thing he taught me. I never lie, even to this day. The only partial exception was in the service of a good practical joke. In addition, he imbued his son with an aversion to extreme ambition, which set Woz apart from Jobs. At an Apple product launch event in 2010, 40 years after they met, Woz reflected on their differences. My father told me, "You always want to be in the middle," he said. I didn't want to be up with the high-level people like Steve. My dad was an engineer, and that's what I wanted to be. I was way too shy ever to be a business leader like Steve. By fourth grade, Wozniak became, as he put it, one of the electronics kids. He had an easier time making eye contact with a transistor than with a girl, and he developed the chunky and stooped look of a guy who spends most of his time hunched over circuit boards. At the same age when Jobs was puzzling over a carbon microphone that his dad couldn't explain, Wozniak was using transistors to build an intercom system featuring amplifiers, relays, lights, and buzzers that connected the kids' bedrooms of 6 houses in the neighborhood. And at an age when Jobs was building Heathkits, Wozniak was assembling a transmitter and receiver from Hallicrafters, the most sophisticated radios available. Woz spent a lot of time at home reading his father's electronics journals, and he became enthralled by stories about new computers, such as the powerful ENIAC. Because Boolean algebra came naturally to him, he marveled at how simple, rather than complex, the computers were. In 8th grade he built a calculator that included 100 transistors, 200 diodes, and 200 resistors on 10 circuit boards. It won top prize in a local contest run by the Air Force, even though the competitors included students through 12th grade. Woz became more of a loner when the boys his age began going out with girls and partying, endeavors that he found far more complex than designing circuits. Where before I was popular and riding bikes and everything, suddenly I was socially shut out, he recalled. It seemed like nobody spoke to me for the longest time. He found an outlet by playing juvenile pranks. In 12th grade he built an electronic metronome, one of those tick-tick-tick devices that keep time in music class, and realized it sounded like a bomb. So he took the labels off some big batteries, taped them together, and put it in a school locker. He rigged it to start ticking faster when the locker opened. Later that day he got called to the principal's office. He thought it was because he had won, yet again, the school's top math prize. Instead he was confronted by the police. The principal had been summoned when the device was found, bravely ran onto the football field clutching it to his chest, and pulled the wires off. Woz tried and failed to suppress his laughter. He actually got sent to the juvenile detention center, where he spent the night. It was a memorable experience. He taught the other prisoners how to disconnect the wires leading to the ceiling fans and connect them to the bars so people got shocked when touching them. Getting shocked was a badge of honor for Woz. He prided himself on being a hardware engineer, which meant that random shocks were routine. He once devised a roulette game where 4 people put their thumbs in a slot. When the ball landed, one would get shocked. Hardware guys will play this game, but software guys are too chicken, he noted. During his senior year he got a part-time job at Sylvania and had the chance to work on a computer for the first time. He learned Fortran from a book and read the manuals for most of the systems of the day, starting with the digital equipment PDP-8. Then he studied the specs for the latest microchips and tried to redesign the computers using these newer parts. The challenge he set himself was to replicate the design using the fewest components possible. Each night he would try to improve his drawing from the night before. By the end of his senior year, he had become a master. I was now designing computers with half the number of chips the actual company had in their own design, but only on paper. He never told his friends. After all, most 17-year-olds were getting their kicks in other ways. On Thanksgiving weekend of his senior year, Wozniak visited the University of Colorado. It was closed for the holiday, but he found an engineering student who took him on a tour of the labs. He begged his father to let him go there, even though the out-of-state tuition was more than the family could easily afford. They struck a deal. He would be allowed to go for 1 year, but then he would transfer to De Anza Community College back home. After arriving at Colorado in the fall of 1969, he spent so much time playing pranks, such as producing reams of printouts saying, "Fuck Nixon," that he failed a couple of his courses and was put on probation. In addition, he created a program to calculate Fibonacci numbers that burned up so much computer time the university threatened to bill him for the cost. So he readily lived up to his bargain with his parents and transferred to De Anza. After a pleasant year at De Anza, Wozniak took time off to make some money. He found work at a company that made computers for the California Motor Vehicle Department, and a coworker made him a wonderful offer. He would provide some spare chips so Wozniak could make one of the computers he had been sketching on paper. Wozniak decided to use as few chips as possible, both as a personal challenge and because he did not want to take advantage of his colleagues' largesse. Much of the work was done in the garage of a friend just around the corner, Bill Fernandez, who was still at Homestead High. To lubricate their efforts, they drank large amounts of Cragmint cream soda, riding their bikes to the Sunnyvale Safeway to return the bottles, collect the deposits, and buy more. That's how we started referring to it as the cream soda computer, Wozniak recalled. It was basically a calculator capable of multiplying numbers entered by a set of switches and displaying the results in binary code with little lights. When it was finished, Fernandez told Wozniak there was someone at Homestead High he should meet. His name is Steve. He likes to do pranks like you do, and he's also into building electronics like you are. It may have been the most significant meeting in a Silicon Valley garage since Hewlett went into Packard's 32 years earlier. Steve and I just sat on the sidewalk in front of Bill's house for the longest time, just sharing stories, mostly about pranks we'd pulled, and also what kind of electronic designs we'd done, Wozniak recalled. We had so much in common. Typically, it was really hard for me to explain to people what kind of design stuff I worked on, but Steve got it right away. And I liked him. He was kind of skinny and wiry and full of energy. Jobs was also impressed. Woz was the first person I'd met who knew more electronics than I did, he once said, stretching his own expertise. I liked him right away. I was a little more mature than my years, and he was a little less mature than his, so it evened out. Woz was very bright, but emotionally he was my age. In addition to their interest in computers, they shared a passion for music. It was an incredible time for music, Jobs recalled. It was like living at a time when Beethoven and Mozart were alive. Really. People will look back on it that way. And Woz and I were deeply into it. In particular, Wozniak turned Jobs onto the glories of Bob Dylan. We tracked down this guy in Santa Cruz who put out this newsletter on Dylan, Jobs said. Dylan taped all of his concerts, and some of the people around him were not scrupulous, because soon there were tapes all around. Bootlegs of everything. And this guy had them all. Hunting down Dylan tapes soon became a joint venture. The two of us would go tramping through San Jose and Berkeley and ask about Dylan bootlegs and collect them, said Wozniak. We'd buy brochures of Dylan lyrics and stay up late interpreting them. Dylan's words struck chords of creative thinking. Added Jobs, I had more than 100 hours, including every concert on the 65 and 66 tour, the one where Dylan went electric. Both of them bought high-end TIAC reel-to-reel tape decks. I would use mine at a low speed to record many concerts on one tape, said Wozniak. Jobs matched his obsession. Instead of big speakers I bought a pair of awesome headphones and would just lie in my bed and listen to that stuff for hours. Jobs had formed a club at Homestead High to put on music and light shows and also play pranks. They once glued a gold-painted toilet seat onto a flower planter. It was called the Buck Fry Club, a play on the name of the principal. Even though they had already graduated, Wozniak and his friend Alan Baum joined forces with Jobs, at the end of his junior year, to produce a farewell gesture for the departing seniors. Showing off the Homestead campus 4 decades later, Jobs paused at the scene of the escapade and pointed. "See that balcony? That's where we did the banner prank that sealed our friendship." On a big bedsheet Baum had tie-dyed with the school's green and white colors, they painted a huge hand flipping the middle finger salute. Baum's nice Jewish mother helped them draw it and showed them how to do the shading and shadows to make it look more real. "I know what that is," she snickered. They devised a system of ropes and pulleys so that it could be dramatically lowered as the graduating class marched past the balcony, and they signed it, Swab Job, the initials of Wozniak and Baum combined with part of Jobs' name. The prank became part of school lore, and got Jobs suspended one more time. Another prank involved a pocket device Wozniak built that could emit TV signals. He would take it to a room where a group of people were watching TV, such as in a dorm, and secretly press the button so that the screen would get fuzzy with static. When someone got up and whacked the set, Wozniak would let go of the button and the picture would clear up. Once he had the unsuspecting viewers hopping up and down at his will, he would make things harder. He would keep the picture fuzzy until someone touched the antenna. Eventually he would make people think they had to hold the antenna while standing on one foot or touching the top of the set. Years later, at a keynote presentation where he was having his own trouble getting a video to work, Jobs broke from his script and recounted the fun they had with the device. Woz would have it in his pocket and we'd go into a dorm where a bunch of folks would be, like, watching Star Trek, and he'd screw up the TV, and someone would go up to fix it, and just as they had the foot off the ground he would turn it back on, and as they put their foot back on the ground he'd screw it up again. Contorting himself into a pretzel on stage, Jobs concluded to great laughter, and within 5 minutes he would have someone like this. The blue box, the ultimate combination of pranks and electronics, and the escapade that helped to create Apple, was launched one Sunday afternoon when Wozniak read an article in Esquire that his mother had left for him on the kitchen table. It was September 1971, and he was about to drive off the next day to Berkeley, his third college. The story, Ron Rosenbaum's Secrets of the Little Blue Box, described how hackers and phone phreakers had found ways to make long-distance calls for free by replicating the tones that routed signals on the AT&T network. Halfway through the article, I had to call my best friend, Steve Jobs, and read parts of this long article to him, Wozniak recalled. He knew that Jobs, then beginning his senior year, was one of the few people who would share his excitement. A hero of the piece was John Draper, a hacker known as Captain Crunch because he had discovered that the sound emitted by the toy whistle that came with the breakfast cereal was the same 2600 Hz tone used by the phone network's call routing switches. It could fool the system into allowing a long-distance call to go through without extra charges. The article revealed that other tones that served to route calls could be found in an issue of the Bell System Technical Journal, which AT&T immediately began asking libraries to pull from their shelves. As soon as Jobs got the call from Wozniak that Sunday afternoon, he knew they would have to get their hands on the technical journal right away. Woz picked me up a few minutes later, and we went to the library at SLAC, the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, to see if we could find it, Jobs recounted. It was Sunday and the library was closed, but they knew how to get in through a door that was rarely locked. I remember that we were furiously digging through the stacks, and it was Woz who finally found the journal with all the frequencies. It was like, holy shit, and we opened it and there it was. We kept saying to ourselves, it's real. Holy shit, it's real. It was all laid out. The tones, the frequencies. Wozniak went to Sunnyvale Electronics before it closed that evening and bought the parts to make an analog tone generator. Jobs had built a frequency counter when he was part of the HP Explorers Club, and they used it to calibrate the desired tones. With a dial, they could replicate and tape record the sounds specified in the article. By midnight they were ready to test it. Unfortunately, the oscillators they used were not quite stable enough to replicate the right chirps to fool the phone company. We could see the instability using Steve's frequency counter, recalled Wozniak, and we just couldn't make it work. I had to leave for Berkeley the next morning, so we decided I would work on building a digital version once I got there. No one had ever created a digital version of a blue box, but Woz was made for the challenge. Using diodes and transistors from Radio Shack, and with the help of a music student in his dorm who had perfect pitch, he got it built before Thanksgiving. I have never designed a circuit I was prouder of, he said. I still think it was incredible. One night Wozniak drove down from Berkeley to Jobs' house to try it. They attempted to call Wozniak's uncle in Los Angeles, but they got a wrong number. It didn't matter, their device had worked. Hi. Or calling you for free. Or calling you for free. Wozniak shouted. The person on the other end was confused and annoyed. Jobs chimed in, we're calling from California. From California. With a blue box. This probably baffled the man even more, since he was also in California. At first the blue box was used for fun and pranks. The most daring of these was when they called the Vatican and Wozniak pretended to be Henry Kissinger wanting to speak to the Pope. They are at the summit meeting in Moscow, and they need to talk to the Pope, Woz intoned. He was told that it was 5:30 a.m. and the Pope was sleeping. When he called back, he got a bishop who was supposed to serve as the translator. But they never actually got the Pope on the line. They realized that Woz wasn't Henry Kissinger, Jobs recalled. We were at a public phone booth. It was then that they reached an important milestone, one that would establish a pattern in their partnerships. Jobs came up with the idea that the blue box could be more than merely a hobby, they could build and sell them. I got together the rest of the components, like the casing and power supply and keypads, and figured out how we could price it, Jobs said, foreshadowing roles he would play when they founded Apple. The finished product was about the size of 2 decks of playing cards. The parts cost about $40, and Jobs decided they should sell it for $150. Following the lead of other phone freaks such as Captain Crunch, they gave themselves handles. Wozniak became Berkeley Blue, Jobs was Oaf Tobark. They took the device to college dorms and gave demonstrations by attaching it to a phone and speaker. While the potential customers watched, they would call the Ritz in London or dial a joke service in Australia. We made 100 or so blue boxes and sold almost all of them, Jobs recalled. The fun and profits came to an end at a Sunnyvale pizza parlor. Jobs and Wozniak were about to drive to Berkeley with a blue box they had just finished making. Jobs needed money and was eager to sell, so he pitched the device to some guys at the next table. They were interested, so Jobs went to a phone booth and demonstrated it with a call to Chicago. The prospects said they had to go to their car for money. So we walk over to the car, Woz and me, and I've got the blue box in my hand, and the guy gets in, reaches under the seat, and he pulls out a gun, Jobs recounted. He had never been that close to a gun, and he was terrified. So he's pointing the gun right at my stomach, and he says, hand it over, brother. My mind raced. There was the car door here, and I thought maybe I could slam it on his legs and we could run, but there was this high probability that he would shoot me. So I slowly handed it to him, very carefully. It was a weird sort of robbery. The guy who took the blue box actually gave Jobs a phone number and said he would try to pay for it if it worked. When Jobs later called the number, the guy said he couldn't figure out how to use it. So Jobs, in his felicitous way, convinced the guy to meet him and Wozniak at a public place. But they ended up deciding not to have another encounter with the gunman, even on the off chance they could get their $150. The partnership paved the way for what would be a bigger adventure together. If it hadn't been for the blue boxes, there wouldn't have been an Apple, Jobs later reflected. I'm 100% sure of that. Woz and I learned how to work together, and we gained the confidence that we could solve technical problems and actually put something into production. They had created a device with a little circuit board that could control billions of dollars worth of infrastructure. You cannot believe how much confidence that gave us. Woz came to the same conclusion. It was probably a bad idea selling them, but it gave us a taste of what we could do with my engineering skills and his vision. The Blue Box adventure established a template for a partnership that would soon be born. Wozniak would be the gentle wizard coming up with a neat invention that he would have been happy just to give away, and Jobs would figure out how to make it user-friendly, put it together in a package, market it, and make a few bucks. Chapter 3 The Dropout Turn On, Tune In. Chrisann Brennan. Toward the end of his senior year at Homestead, in the spring of 1972, Jobs started going out with a girl named Chrisann Brennan, who was about his age but still a junior. With her light brown hair, green eyes, high cheekbones, and fragile aura, she was very attractive. She was also enduring the breakup of her parents' marriage, which made her vulnerable. We worked together on an animated movie, then started going out, and she became my first real girlfriend, Jobs recalled. As Brennan later said, Steve was kind of crazy. That's why I was attracted to him. Jobs's craziness was of the cultivated sort. He had begun his lifelong experiments with compulsive diets, eating only fruits and vegetables, so he was as lean and tight as a whippet. He learned to stare at people without blinking, and he perfected long silences punctuated by staccato bursts of fast talking. This odd mix of intensity and aloofness, combined with his shoulder-length hair and scraggly beard, gave him the aura of a crazed shaman. He oscillated between charismatic and creepy. He shuffled around and looked half mad, recalled Brennan. He had a lot of angst. It was like a big darkness around him. Jobs had begun to drop acid by then, and he turned Brennan onto it as well, in a wheat field just outside Sunnyvale. It was great, he recalled. I had been listening to a lot of Bach. All of a sudden the wheat field was playing Bach. It was the most wonderful feeling of my life up to that point. I felt like the conductor of this symphony with Bach coming through the wheat. That summer of 1972, after his graduation, he and Brennan moved to a cabin in the hills above Los Altos. I'm going to go live in a cabin with Chrisanne, he announced to his parents one day. His father was furious. No you're not, he said. Over my dead body. They had recently fought about marijuana, and once again the younger Jobs was willful. He just said goodbye and walked out. Brennan spent a lot of her time that summer painting. She was talented, and she did a picture of a clown for Jobs that he kept on the wall. Jobs wrote poetry and played guitar. He could be brutally cold and rude to her at times, but he was also entrancing and able to impose his will. He was an enlightened being who was cruel, she recalled. That's a strange combination. Midway through the summer, Jobs was almost killed when his red Fiat caught fire. He was driving on Skyline Boulevard in the Santa Cruz Mountains with a high school friend, Tim Brown, who looked back, saw flames coming from the engine, and casually said to Jobs, "Pull over, your car is on fire." Jobs did. His father, despite their arguments, drove out to the hills to tow the Fiat home. In order to find a way to make money for a new car, Jobs got Wozniak to drive him to De Anza College to look on the Help Wanted bulletin board. They discovered that the Westgate Shopping Center in San Jose was seeking college students who could dress up in costumes and amuse the kids. So for $3 an hour, Jobs, Wozniak, and Brennan donned heavy full-body costumes and headgear to play Alice in Wonderland, the Mad Hatter, and the White Rabbit. Wozniak, in his earnest and sweet way, found it fun. I said, I want to do it, it's my chance, because I love children. I think Steve looked at it as a lousy job, but I looked at it as a fun adventure. Jobs did indeed find it a pain. It was hot, the costumes were heavy, and after a while I felt like I wanted to smack some of the kids. Patience was never one of his virtues. Reed College 17 years earlier, Jobs's parents had made a pledge when they adopted him, he would go to college. So they had worked hard and saved dutifully for his college fund, which was modest but adequate by the time he graduated. But Jobs, becoming ever more willful, did not make it easy. At first he toyed with not going to college at all. I think I might have headed to New York if I didn't go to college, he recalled, musing on how different his world, and perhaps all of ours, might have been if he had chosen that path. When his parents pushed him to go to college, he responded in a passive-aggressive way. He did not consider state schools, such as Berkeley, where Woz then was, despite the fact that they were more affordable. Nor did he look at Stanford, just up the road and likely to offer a scholarship. The kids who went to Stanford, they already knew what they wanted to do, he said. They weren't really artistic. I wanted something that was more artistic and interesting. Instead he insisted on applying only to Reed College, a private liberal arts school in Portland, Oregon, that was one of the most expensive in the nation. He was visiting Woz at Berkeley when his father called to say an acceptance letter had arrived from Reed, and he tried to talk Steve out of going there. So did his mother. It was far more than they could afford, they said. But their son responded with an ultimatum. If he couldn't go to Reed, he wouldn't go anywhere. They relented, as usual. Reed had only 1,000 students, half the number at Homestead High. It was known for its free-spirited hippie lifestyle, which combined somewhat uneasily with its rigorous academic standards and core curriculum. 5 years earlier Timothy Leary, the guru of psychedelic enlightenment, had sat cross-legged at the Reed College Commons while on his League for Spiritual Discovery (LSD) college tour, during which he exhorted his listeners, like every great religion of the past, we seek to find the divinity within. These ancient goals we define in the metaphor of the present: turn on, tune in, drop out. Many of Reed's students took all three of those injunctions seriously. The dropout rate during the 1970s was more than one-third. When it came time for Jobs to matriculate in the fall of 1972, his parents drove him up to Portland, but in another small act of rebellion he refused to let them come on campus. In fact, he refrained from even saying goodbye or thanks. He recounted the moment later with uncharacteristic regret. "It's one of the things in life I really feel ashamed about. I was not very sensitive, and I hurt their feelings. I shouldn't have. They had done so much to make sure I could go there, but I just didn't want them around. I didn't want anyone to know I had parents. I wanted to be like an orphan who had bummed around the country on trains and just arrived out of nowhere, with no roots, no connections, no background." In late 1972, there was a fundamental shift happening in American campus life. The nation's involvement in the Vietnam War, and the draft that accompanied it, was winding down. Political activism at colleges receded, and in many late-night dorm conversations was replaced by an interest in pathways to personal fulfillment. Jobs found himself deeply influenced by a variety of books on spirituality and enlightenment, most notably Be Here Now, A Guide to Meditation and the Wonders of Psychedelic Drugs by Baba Ram Dass, born Richard Alpert. "It was profound," Jobs said. "It transformed me and many of my friends." The closest of those friends was another wispy-bearded freshman named Daniel Kotke, who met Jobs a week after they arrived at Reed and shared his interest in Zen, Dylan, and acid. Kotke, from a wealthy New York suburb, was smart but low-octane, with a sweet flower child demeanor made even mellower by his interest in Buddhism. That spiritual quest had caused him to eschew material possessions, but he was nonetheless impressed by Jobs's tape deck. "Steve had a TIAC reel-to-reel and massive quantities of Dylan bootlegs," Kotke recalled. "He was both really cool and high-tech." Jobs started spending much of his time with Kotke and his girlfriend, Elizabeth Holmes, even after he insulted her at their first meeting by grilling her about how much money it would take to get her to have sex with another man. They hitchhiked to the coast together, engaged in the typical dorm raps about the meaning of life, attended the love festivals at the local Hare Krishna temple, and went to the Zen Center for free vegetarian meals. "It was a lot of fun," said Kotke, "but also philosophical, and we took Zen very seriously." Jobs began sharing with Kotke other books, including Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryu Suzuki, Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda, and Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism by Chogyam Trungpa. They created a meditation room in the attic crawl space above Elizabeth Holmes's room and fixed it up with Indian prints, a dari rug, candles, incense, and meditation cushions. There was a hatch in the ceiling leading to an attic which had a huge amount of space, Jobs said. "We took psychedelic drugs there sometimes, but mainly we just meditated." Jobs's engagement with Eastern spirituality, and especially Zen Buddhism, was not just some passing fancy or youthful dabbling. He embraced it with his typical intensity, and it became deeply ingrained in his personality. "Steve is very much Zen," said Kotke. "It was a deep influence. You see it in his whole approach of stark, minimalist aesthetics, intense focus." Jobs also became deeply influenced by the emphasis that Buddhism places on intuition. "I began to realize that an intuitive understanding and consciousness was more significant than abstract thinking and intellectual logical analysis," he later said. His intensity, however, made it difficult for him to achieve inner peace. His Zen awareness was not accompanied by an excess of calm, peace of mind, or interpersonal mellowness. He and Kotke enjoyed playing a 19th-century German variant of chess called Kriegspiel, in which the players sit back to back. Each has his own board and pieces and cannot see those of his opponent. A moderator informs them if a move they want to make is legal or illegal, and they have to try to figure out where their opponent's pieces are. "The wildest game I played with them was during a lashing rainstorm sitting by the fireside," recalled Holmes, who served as moderator. "They were tripping on acid. They were moving so fast I could barely keep up with them." Another book that deeply influenced Jobs during his freshman year was Diet for a Small Planet by Francis Moore Lappe, which extolled the personal and planetary benefits of vegetarianism. "That's when I swore off meat pretty much for good," he recalled. But the book also reinforced his tendency to embrace extreme diets, which included purges, fasts, or eating only one or two foods, such as carrots or apples, for weeks on end. Jobs and Kotke became serious vegetarians during their freshman year. Steve got into it even more than I did, said Kotke. He was living off Roman meal cereal. They would go shopping at a farmer's co-op, where Jobs would buy a box of cereal, which would last a week, and other bulk health food. He would buy flats of dates and almonds and lots of carrots, and he got a champion juicer and we'd make carrot juice and carrot salads. There is a story about Steve turning orange from eating so many carrots, and there is some truth to that. Friends remember him having, at times, a sunset-like orange hue. Jobs's dietary habits became even more obsessive when he read Mucusless Diet Healing System by Arnold Ehret, an early 20th century German-born nutrition fanatic. He believed in eating nothing but fruits and starchless vegetables, which he said prevented the body from forming harmful mucus, and he advocated cleansing the body regularly through prolonged fasts. That meant the end of even Roman meal cereal, or any bread, grains, or milk. Jobs began warning friends of the mucus dangers lurking in their bagels. I got into it in my typical nutso way, he said. At one point he and Kotke went for an entire week eating only apples, and then Jobs began to try even fewer fasts. He started with 2-day fasts, and eventually tried to stretch them to a week or more, breaking them carefully with large amounts of water and leafy vegetables. After a week you start to feel fantastic, he said. You get a ton of vitality from not having to digest all this food. I was in great shape. I felt I could get up and walk to San Francisco anytime I wanted. Vegetarianism and Zen Buddhism, meditation and spirituality, acid and rock, Jobs rolled together, in an amped-up way, the multiple impulses that were hallmarks of the Enlightenment-seeking campus subculture of the era. And even though he barely indulged it at Reed, there was still an undercurrent of electronic geekiness in his soul that would someday combine surprisingly well with the rest of the mix. Robert Friedland. In order to raise some cash one day, Jobs decided to sell his IBM Selectric typewriter. He walked into the room of the student who had offered to buy it only to discover that he was having sex with his girlfriend. Jobs started to leave, but the student invited him to take a seat and wait while they finished. I thought, this is kind of far out, Jobs later recalled. And thus began his relationship with Robert Friedland, one of the few people in Jobs's life who were able to mesmerize him. He adopted some of Friedland's charismatic traits and for a few years treated him almost like a guru, until he began to see him as a charlatan. Friedland was 4 years older than Jobs, but still an undergraduate. The son of an Auschwitz survivor who became a prosperous Chicago architect, he had originally gone to Bowdoin, a liberal arts college in Maine. But while a sophomore, he was arrested for possession of 24,000 tablets of LSD worth $125,000. The local newspaper pictured him with shoulder-length wavy blonde hair smiling at the photographers as he was led away. He was sentenced to 2 years at a federal prison in Virginia, from which he was paroled in 1972. That fall he headed off to Reed, where he immediately ran for student body president, saying that he needed to clear his name from the miscarriage of justice he had suffered. He won. Friedland had heard Baba Ram Dass, the author of Be Here Now, give a speech in Boston, and like Jobs and Kotke had gotten deeply into Eastern spirituality. During the summer of 1973, he traveled to India to meet Ram Dass's Hindu guru, Neem Karoli Baba, famously known to his many followers as Maharaj Ji. When he returned that fall, Friedland had taken a spiritual name and walked around in sandals and flowing Indian robes. He had a room off campus, above a garage, and Jobs would go there many afternoons to seek him out. He was entranced by the apparent intensity of Friedland's conviction that a state of enlightenment truly existed and could be attained. He turned me on to a different level of consciousness, Jobs said. Friedland found Jobs fascinating as well. He was always walking around barefoot, he later told a reporter. The thing that struck me was his intensity. Whatever he was interested in he would generally carry to an irrational extreme. Jobs had honed his trick of using stares and silences to master other people. One of his numbers was to stare at the person he was talking to. He would stare into their fucking eyeballs, ask some question, and would want a response without the other person averting their eyes. According to Kotke, some of Jobs's personality traits, including a few that lasted throughout his career, were borrowed from Friedland. Friedland taught Steve the reality distortion field, said Kotke. He was charismatic and a bit of a con man and could bend situations to his very strong will. He was mercurial, sure of himself, a little dictatorial. Steve admired that, and he became more like that after spending time with Robert. Jobs also absorbed how Friedland made himself the center of attention. Robert was very much an outgoing, charismatic guy, a real salesman, Kotke recalled. When I first met Steve he was shy and self-effacing, a very private guy. I think Robert taught him a lot about selling, about coming out of his shell, of opening up and taking charge of a situation. Friedland projected a high wattage aura. He would walk into a room and you would instantly notice him. Steve was the absolute opposite when he came to read. After he spent time with Robert, some of it started to rub off. On Sunday evenings Jobs and Friedland would go to the Hare Krishna temple on the western edge of Portland, often with Kotke and Holmes in tow. They would dance and sing songs at the top of their lungs. We would work ourselves into an ecstatic frenzy, Holmes recalled. Robert would go insane and dance like crazy. Steve was more subdued, as if he was embarrassed to let loose. Then they would be treated to paper plates piled high with vegetarian food. Friedland had stewardship of a 220-acre apple farm, about 40 miles southwest of Portland, that was owned by an eccentric millionaire uncle from Switzerland named Marcel Muller. After Friedland became involved with Eastern spirituality, he turned it into a commune called the All One Farm, and Jobs would spend weekends there with Kotke, Holmes, and like-minded seekers of enlightenment. The farm had a main house, a large barn, and a garden shed, where Kotke and Holmes slept. Jobs took on the task of pruning the Gravenstein apple trees. Steve ran the apple orchard, said Friedland. We were in the organic cider business. Steve's job was to lead a crew of freaks to prune the orchard and whip it back into shape. Monks and disciples from the Hare Krishna temple would come and prepare vegetarian feasts redolent of cumin, coriander, and turmeric. Steve would be starving when he arrived, and he would stuff himself, Holmes recalled. Then he would go and purge. For years I thought he was bulimic. It was very upsetting, because we had gone to all the trouble of creating these feasts, and he couldn't hold it down. Jobs was also beginning to have a little trouble stomaching Friedland's cult leader style. Perhaps he saw a little bit too much of Robert in himself, said Kotke. Although the commune was supposed to be a refuge from materialism, Friedland began operating it more as a business. His followers were told to chop and sell firewood, make apple presses and wood stoves, and engage in other commercial endeavors for which they were not paid. One night Jobs slept under the table in the kitchen and was amused to notice that people kept coming in and stealing each other's food from the refrigerator. Communal economics were not for him. It started to get very materialistic, Jobs recalled. Everybody got the idea they were working very hard for Robert's farm, and one by one they started to leave. I got pretty sick of it. Many years later, after Friedland had become a billionaire copper and gold mining executive, working out of Vancouver, Singapore, and Mongolia, I met him for drinks in New York. That evening I emailed Jobs and mentioned my encounter. He telephoned me from California within an hour and warned me against listening to Friedland. He said that when Friedland was in trouble because of environmental abuses committed by some of his mines, he had tried to contact Jobs to intervene with Bill Clinton, but Jobs had not responded. Robert always portrayed himself as a spiritual person, but he crossed the line from being charismatic to being a con man, Jobs said. It was a strange thing to have one of the spiritual people in your young life turn out to be, symbolically and in reality, a gold miner. Dropout Jobs quickly became bored with college. He liked being at Reed, just not taking the required classes. In fact he was surprised when he found out that, for all of its hippie aura, there were strict course requirements. When Wozniak came to visit, Jobs waved his schedule at him and complained, "They are making me take all these courses." Woz replied, "Yes, that's what they do in college." Jobs refused to go to the classes he was assigned and instead went to the ones he wanted, such as a dance class where he could enjoy both the creativity and the chance to meet girls. "I would never have refused to take the courses you were supposed to, that's a difference in our personality," Wozniak marveled. Jobs also began to feel guilty, he later said, about spending so much of his parents' money on an education that did not seem worthwhile. "All of my working-class parents' savings were being spent on my college tuition," he recounted in a famous commencement address at Stanford. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was spending all of the money my parents had saved their entire life. So I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay. He didn't actually want to leave Reed, he just wanted to quit paying tuition and taking classes that didn't interest him. Remarkably, Reed tolerated that. He had a very inquiring mind that was enormously attractive, said the Dean of Students, Jack Dudman. He refused to accept automatically received truths, and he wanted to examine everything himself. Dudman allowed Jobs to audit classes and stay with friends in the dorms even after he stopped paying tuition. The minute I dropped out I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me, and begin dropping in on the ones that looked interesting, he said. Among them was a calligraphy class that appealed to him after he saw posters on campus that were beautifully drawn. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture, and I found it fascinating. It was yet another example of Jobs consciously positioning himself at the intersection of the arts and technology. In all of his products, technology would be married to great design, elegance, human touches, and even romance. He would be in the fore of pushing friendly graphical user interfaces. The calligraphy course would become iconic in that regard. If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. And since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have them. In the meantime Jobs eked out a bohemian existence on the fringes of Reed. He went barefoot most of the time, wearing sandals when it snowed. Elizabeth Holmes made meals for him, trying to keep up with his obsessive diets. He returned soda bottles for spare change, continued his treks to the free Sunday dinners at the Hare Krishna temple, and wore a down jacket in the heatless garage apartment he rented for $20 a month. When he needed money, he found work at the psychology department lab maintaining the electronic equipment that was used for animal behavior experiments. Occasionally Chris and Brennan would come to visit. Their relationship sputtered along erratically. But mostly he tended to the stirrings of his own soul and personal quest for enlightenment. I came of age at a magical time, he reflected later. Our consciousness was raised by Zen, and also by LSD. Even later in life he would credit psychedelic drugs for making him more enlightened. Taking LSD was a profound experience, one of the most important things in my life. LSD shows you that there's another side to the coin, and you can't remember it when it wears off, but you know it. It reinforced my sense of what was important, creating great things instead of making money, putting things back into the stream of history and of human consciousness as much as I could. Chapter 4 Atari in India Zen and the Art of Game Design Atari in February 1974. After 18 months of hanging around Reed, Jobs decided to move back to his parents' home in Los Altos and look for a job. It was not a difficult search. At peak times during the 1970s, the classified section of the San Jose Mercury carried up to 60 pages of technology help-wanted ads. One of those caught Jobs' eye. Have fun, make money, it said. That day Jobs walked into the lobby of the video game manufacturer Atari and told the personnel director, who was startled by his unkempt hair and attire, that he wouldn't leave until they gave him a job. Atari's founder was a burly entrepreneur named Nolan Bushnell, who was a charismatic visionary with a nice touch of showmanship in him. In other words, another role model waiting to be emulated. After he became famous, he liked driving around in a Rolls, smoking dope, and holding staff meetings in a hot tub. As Friedland had done and as Jobs would learn to do, he was able to turn charm into a cunning force, to cajole and intimidate and distort reality with the power of his personality. His chief engineer was Al Alcorn, beefy and jovial and a bit more grounded, the house grown-up trying to implement the vision and curb the enthusiasms of Bushnell. Their big hit thus far was a video game called Pong, in which two players tried to volley a blip on a screen with two movable lines that acted as paddles. If you're under 30, ask your parents. When Jobs arrived in the Atari lobby wearing sandals and demanding a job, Alcorn was the one who was summoned. I was told, we've got a hippie kid in the lobby. He says he's not going to leave until we hire him. Should we call the cops or let him in? I said bring him on in. Jobs thus became one of the first 50 employees at Atari, working as a technician for $5 an hour. In retrospect, it was weird to hire a dropout from Reed, Alcorn recalled. But I saw something in him. He was very intelligent, enthusiastic, excited about tech. Alcorn assigned him to work with a straight-laced engineer named Don Lang. The next day Lang complained, "This guy's a goddamn hippie with B.O. Why did you do this to me? And he's impossible to deal with." Jobs clung to the belief that his fruit-heavy vegetarian diet would prevent not just mucus but also body odor, even if he didn't use deodorant or shower regularly. It was a flawed theory. Lang and others wanted to let Jobs go, but Bushnell worked out a solution. "The smell and behavior wasn't an issue with me," he said. "Steve was prickly, but I kind of liked him. So I asked him to go on the night shift. It was a way to save him." Jobs would come in after Lang and others had left and work through most of the night. Even thus isolated, he became known for his brashness. On those occasions when he happened to interact with others, he was prone to informing them that they were dumb shits. In retrospect, he stands by that judgment. "The only reason I shone was that everyone else was so bad," Jobs recalled. Despite his arrogance, or perhaps because of it, he was able to charm Atari's boss. "He was more philosophical than the other people I worked with," Bushnell recalled. "We used to discuss free will versus determinism. I tended to believe that things were much more determined, that we were programmed. If we had perfect information, we could predict people's actions." Steve felt the opposite. That outlook accorded with his faith in the power of the will to bend reality. Jobs helped improve some of the games by pushing the chips to produce fun designs, and Bushnell's inspiring willingness to play by his own rules rubbed off on him. In addition, he intuitively appreciated the simplicity of Atari's games. They came with no manual and needed to be uncomplicated enough that a stoned freshman could figure them out. The only instructions for Atari's Star Trek game were, 1. Insert quarter. 2. Avoid Klingons. Not all of his coworkers shunned Jobs. He became friends with Ron Wayne, a draftsman at Atari, who had earlier started a company that built slot machines. It subsequently failed, but Jobs became fascinated with the idea that it was possible to start your own company. "Ron was an amazing guy," said Jobs. "He started companies. I had never met anybody like that." He proposed to Wayne that they go into business together. Jobs said he could borrow $50,000, and they could design and market a slot machine. But Wayne had already been burned in business, so he declined. "I said that was the quickest way to lose $50,000, Wayne recalled, but I admired the fact that he had a burning drive to start his own business. One weekend Jobs was visiting Wayne at his apartment, engaging as they often did in philosophical discussions, when Wayne said that there was something he needed to tell him. "Yeah, I think I know what it is," Jobs replied. "I think you like men." Wayne said yes. "It was my first encounter with someone who I knew was gay," Jobs recalled. "He planted the right perspective of it for me." Jobs grilled him, "When you see a beautiful woman, what do you feel?" Wayne replied, "It's like when you look at a beautiful horse. You can appreciate it, but you don't want to sleep with it. You appreciate beauty for what it is." Wayne said that it is a testament to Jobs that he felt like revealing this to him. "Nobody at Atari knew, and I could count on my toes and fingers the number of people I told in my whole life. But I guess it just felt right to tell him, that he would understand, and it didn't have any effect on our relationship." India. One reason Jobs was eager to make some money in early 1974 was that Robert Friedland, who had gone to India the summer before, was urging him to take his own spiritual journey there. Friedland had studied in India with Neem Karoli Baba Maharaj Ji, who had been the guru to much of the 60s hippie movement. Jobs decided he should do the same, and he recruited Daniel Kotke to go with him. Jobs was not motivated by mere adventure. "For me it was a serious search," he said. "I'd been turned on to the idea of enlightenment and trying to figure out who I was and how I fit into things." Kotke adds that Jobs's quest seemed driven partly by not knowing his birth parents. There was a hole in him, and he was trying to fill it. When Jobs told the folks at Atari that he was quitting to go search for a guru in India, the jovial Alcorn was amused. "He comes in and stares at me and declares, 'I'm going to find my guru,' and I say, 'No shit, that's super. Right me.' And he says he wants me to help pay, and I tell him, bullshit." Then Alcorn had an idea. Atari was making kits and shipping them to Munich, where they were built into finished machines and distributed by a wholesaler in Turin. But there was a problem. Because the games were designed for the American rate of 60 frames per second, there were frustrating interference problems in Europe, where the rate was 50 frames per second. Alcorn sketched out a fix with Jobs and then offered to pay for him to go to Europe to implement it. "It's got to be cheaper to get to India from there," he said. Jobs agreed. So Alcorn sent him on his way with the exhortation, "Say hi to your guru for me." Jobs spent a few days in Munich, where he solved the interference problem, but in the process he flummoxed the dark-suited German managers. They complained to Alcorn that he dressed and smelled like a bum and behaved rudely. I said, "Did he solve the problem?" And they said, "Yeah." I said, "If you got any more problems, you just call me, I got more guys just like him." They said, No, we'll take care of it next time." For his part, Jobs was upset that the Germans kept trying to feed him meat and potatoes. "They don't even have a word for vegetarian," he complained, incorrectly, in a phone call to Alcorn. He had a better time when he took the train to see the distributor in Turin, where the Italian pastas and his host's camaraderie were more simpatico. "I had a wonderful couple of weeks in Turin, which is this charged-up industrial town," he recalled. "The distributor took me every night to dinner at this place where there were only 8 tables and no menu. You'd just tell them what you wanted, and they made it. One of the tables was on reserve for the chairman of Fiat. It was really super." He next went to Lugano, Switzerland, where he stayed with Fred Land's uncle, and from there took a flight to India. When he got off the plane in New Delhi, he felt waves of heat rising from the tarmac, even though it was only April. He had been given the name of a hotel, but it was full, so he went to one his taxi driver insisted was good. "I'm sure he was getting some baksheesh, because he took me to this complete dive." Jobs asked the owner whether the water was filtered and foolishly believed the answer. "I got dysentery pretty fast. I was sick, really sick, a really high fever. I dropped from 160 pounds to 120 in about a week." Once he got healthy enough to move, he decided that he needed to get out of Delhi. So he headed to the town of Haridwar, in western India near the source of the Ganges, which was having a festival known as the Kumbh Mela. More than 10 million people poured into a town that usually contained fewer than 100,000 residents. There were holy men all around. Tense with this teacher and the teacher. There were people riding elephants, you name it. I was there for a few days, but I decided that I needed to get out of there too. He went by train and bus to a village near Nainital in the foothills of the Himalayas. That was where Neem Karoli Baba lived, or had lived. By the time Jobs got there, he was no longer alive, at least in the same incarnation. Jobs rented a room with a mattress on the floor from a family who helped him recuperate by feeding him vegetarian meals. There was a copy there of Autobiography of a Yogi in English that a previous traveler had left, and I read it several times because there was not a lot to do, and I walked around from village to village and recovered from my dysentery. Among those who were part of the community there was Larry Brilliant, an epidemiologist who was working to eradicate smallpox and who later ran Google's philanthropic arm and the Skoll Foundation. He became Jobs' lifelong friend. At one point Jobs was told of a young Hindu holy man who was holding a gathering of his followers at the Himalayan estate of a wealthy businessman. It was a chance to meet a spiritual being and hang out with his followers, but it was also a chance to have a good meal. I could smell the food as we got near, and I was very hungry. As Jobs was eating, the holy man, who was not much older than Jobs, picked him out of the crowd, pointed at him, and began laughing maniacally. He came running over and grabbed me and made a tooting sound and said, "You are just like a baby," recalled Jobs. I was not relishing this attention. Taking Jobs by the hand, he led him out of the worshipful crowd and walked him up to a hill, where there was a well and a small pond. We sit down and he pulls out this straight razor. I'm thinking he's a nutcase and begin to worry. Then he pulls out a bar of soap. I had long hair at the time, and he lathered up my hair and shaved my head. He told me that he was saving my health. Daniel Kotke arrived in India at the beginning of the summer, and Jobs went back to New Delhi to meet him. They wandered, mainly by bus, rather aimlessly. By this point Jobs was no longer trying to find a guru who could impart wisdom, but instead was seeking enlightenment through ascetic experience, deprivation, and simplicity. He was not able to achieve inner calm. Kotke remembers him getting into a furious shouting match with a Hindu woman in a village marketplace who, Jobs alleged, had been watering down the milk she was selling them. Yet Jobs could also be generous. When they got to the town of Manali, Kotke's sleeping bag was stolen with his traveler's checks in it. Steve covered my food expenses and bus ticket back to Delhi, Kotke recalled. He also gave Kotke the rest of his own money, $100, to tide him over. During his 7 months in India, he had written to his parents only sporadically, getting mail at the American Express office in New Delhi when he passed through, and so they were somewhat surprised when they got a call from the Oakland airport asking them to pick him up. They immediately drove up from Los Altos. My head had been shaved, I was wearing Indian cotton robes, and my skin had turned a deep, chocolate brown red from the sun, he recalled. So I'm sitting there and my parents walked past me about 5 times and finally my mother came up and said, "Steve." And I said, "Hi." They took him back home, where he continued trying to find himself. It was a pursuit with many paths toward enlightenment. In the mornings and evenings he would meditate and study Zen, and in between he would drop into audit physics or engineering courses at Stanford. The search Jobs's interest in Eastern spirituality, Hinduism, Zen Buddhism, and the search for enlightenment was not merely the passing phase of a 19-year-old. Throughout his life he would seek to follow many of the basic precepts of Eastern religions, such as the emphasis on experiential prajna, wisdom or cognitive understanding that is intuitively experienced through concentration of the mind. Years later, sitting in his Palo Alto garden, he reflected on the lasting influence of his trip to India. Coming back to America was, for me, much more of a cultural shock than going to India. The people in the Indian countryside don't use their intellect like we do, they use their intuition instead, and their intuition is far more developed than in the rest of the world. Intuition is a very powerful thing, more powerful than intellect, in my opinion. That's had a big impact on my work. Western rational thought is not an innate human characteristic, it is learned and is the great achievement of Western civilization. In the villages of India, they never learned it. They learned something else, which is in some ways just as valuable but in other ways is not. That's the power of intuition and experiential wisdom. Coming back after 7 months in Indian villages, I saw the craziness of the Western world as well as its capacity for rational thought. If you just sit and observe, you will see how restless your mind is. If you try to calm it, it only makes it worse, but over time it does calm. And when it does, there's room to hear more subtle things. That's when your intuition starts to blossom and you start to see things more clearly and be in the present more. Your mind just slows down, and you see a tremendous expanse in the moment. You see so much more than you could see before. It's a discipline, you have to practice it. Zen has been a deep influence in my life ever since. At one point I was thinking about going to Japan and trying to get into the Eiheiji monastery, but my spiritual advisor urged me to stay here. He said there is nothing over there that isn't here, and he was correct. I learned the truth of the Zen saying that if you are willing to travel around the world to meet a teacher, one will appear next door. Jobs did in fact find a teacher right in his own neighborhood. Shunryu Suzuki, who wrote Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind and ran the San Francisco Zen Center, used to come to Los Altos every Wednesday evening to lecture and meditate with a small group of followers. After a while he asked his assistant, Kobun Chino Otogawa, to open a full-time center there. Jobs became a faithful follower, along with his occasional girlfriend, Chris Ann Brennan, and Daniel Kotke and Elizabeth Holmes. He also began to go by himself on retreats to the Tassajara Zen Center, a monastery near Carmel where Kobun also taught. Kotke found Kobun amusing. His English was atrocious, he recalled. He would speak in a kind of haiku, with poetic, suggestive phrases. We would sit and listen to him, and half the time we had no idea what he was going on about. I took the whole thing as a kind of light-hearted interlude. Holmes was more into the scene. We would go to Kobun's meditations, sit on zafu cushions, and he would sit on a dais, she said. We learned how to tune out distractions. It was a magical thing. One evening we were meditating with Kobun when it was raining, and he taught us how to use ambient sounds to bring us back to focus on our meditation. As for Jobs, his devotion was intense. He became really serious and self-important and just generally unbearable, according to Kotke. He began meeting with Kobun almost daily, and every few months they went on retreats together to meditate. I ended up spending as much time as I could with him, Jobs recalled. He had a wife who was a nurse at Stanford and 2 kids. She worked the night shift, so I would go over and hang out with him in the evenings. She would get home about midnight and shoo me away. They sometimes discussed whether Jobs should devote himself fully to spiritual pursuits, but Coben counseled otherwise. He assured Jobs that he could keep in touch with his spiritual side while working in a business. The relationship turned out to be lasting and deep. 17 years later Coben would perform Jobs's wedding ceremony. Jobs's compulsive search for self-awareness also led him to undergo primal scream therapy, which had recently been developed and popularized by a Los Angeles psychotherapist named Arthur Yanov. It was based on the Freudian theory that psychological problems are caused by the repressed pains of childhood. Yanov argued that they could be resolved by re-suffering these primal moments while fully expressing the pain, sometimes in screams. To Jobs, this seemed preferable to talk therapy because it involved intuitive feeling and emotional action rather than just rational analyzing. This was not something to think about, he later said. This was something to do, to close your eyes, hold your breath, jump in, and come out the other end more insightful. A group of Janov's adherents ran a program called the Oregon Feelings Center in an old hotel in Eugene that was managed by Jobs's Reed College guru Robert Friedland, whose all-one farm commune was nearby. In late 1974, Jobs signed up for a 12-week course of therapy there costing $1,000. Steve and I were both into personal growth, so I wanted to go with him, Kotke recounted, but I couldn't afford it. Jobs confided to close friends that he was driven by the pain he was feeling about being put up for adoption and not knowing about his birth parents. Steve had a very profound desire to know his physical parents so he could better know himself, Friedland later said. He had learned from Paul and Clara Jobs that his birth parents had both been graduate students at a university and that his father might be Syrian. He had even thought about hiring a private investigator, but he decided not to do so for the time being. I didn't want to hurt my parents, he recalled, referring to Paul and Clara. He was struggling with the fact that he had been adopted, according to Elizabeth Holmes. He felt that it was an issue that he needed to get hold of emotionally. Jobs admitted as much to her. This is something that is bothering me, and I need to focus on it, he said. He was even more open with Greg Calhoun. He was doing a lot of soul-searching about being adopted, and he talked about it with me a lot, Calhoun recalled. The primal scream and the mucusless diets, he was trying to cleanse himself and get deeper into his frustration about his birth. He told me he was deeply angry about the fact that he had been given up. John Lennon had undergone the same primal scream therapy in 1970, and in December of that year he released the song, Mother, with the Plastic Ono Band. It dealt with Lennon's own feelings about a father who had abandoned him and a mother who had been killed when he was a teenager. The refrain includes the haunting chant, Mama don't go, Daddy come home. Jobs used to play the song often. Jobs later said that Janov's teachings did not prove very useful. He offered a ready-made, buttoned-down answer which turned out to be far too oversimplistic. It became obvious that it was not going to yield any great insight. But Holmes contended that it made him more confident. After he did it, he was in a different place. He had a very abrasive personality, but there was a peace about him for a while. His confidence improved and his feelings of inadequacy were reduced. Jobs came to believe that he could impart that feeling of confidence to others and thus push them to do things they hadn't thought possible. Holmes had broken up with Kotke and joined a religious cult in San Francisco that expected her to sever ties with all past friends. But Jobs rejected that injunction. He arrived at the cult house in his Ford Ranchero one day and announced that he was driving up to Fredland's apple farm and she was to come. Even more brazenly, he said she would have to drive part of the way, even though she didn't know how to use the stick shift. Once we got on the open road, he made me get behind the wheel, and he shifted the car until we got up to 55 miles per hour, she recalled. Then he puts on a tape of Dylan's Blood on the tracks, lays his head in my lap, and goes to sleep. He had the attitude that he could do anything, and therefore so can you. He put his life in my hands. So that made me do something I didn't think I could do. It was the brighter side of what would become known as his reality distortion field. If you trust him, you can do things, Holmes said. If he's decided that something should happen, then he's just going to make it happen. Breakout one day in early 1975 Al Alcorn was sitting in his office at Atari when Ron Wayne burst in. Hey, Stevie is back, he shouted. Wow, bring him on in, Alcorn replied. Jobs shuffled in barefoot, wearing a saffron robe and carrying a copy of Be Here Now, which he handed to Alcorn and insisted he read. Can I have my job back? He asked. He looked like a Hare Krishna guy, but it was great to see him, Alcorn recalled. So I said, sure. Once again, for the sake of harmony, Jobs worked mostly at night. Wozniak, who was living in an apartment nearby and working at HP, would come by after dinner to hang out and play the video games. He had become addicted to Pong at a Sunnyvale bowling alley, and he was able to build a version that he hooked up to his home TV set. One day in the late summer of 1975, Nolan Bushnell, defying the prevailing wisdom that paddle games were over, decided to develop a single-player version of Pong. Instead of competing against an opponent, the player would volley the ball into a wall that lost a brick whenever it was hit. He called Jobs into his office, sketched it out on his little blackboard, and asked him to design it. There would be a bonus, Bushnell told him, for every chip fewer than 50 that he used. Bushnell knew that Jobs was not a great engineer, but he assumed, correctly, that he would recruit Wozniak, who was always hanging around. I looked at it as a two-for-one thing, Bushnell recalled. Woz was a better engineer. Wozniak was thrilled when Jobs asked him to help and proposed splitting the fee. This was the most wonderful offer in my life, to actually design a game that people would use, he recalled. Jobs said it had to be done in 4 days and with the fewest chips possible. What he hid from Wozniak was that the deadline was one that Jobs had imposed, because he needed to get to the all-one farm to help prepare for the apple harvest. He also didn't mention that there was a bonus tied to keeping down the number of chips. A game like this might take most engineers a few months, Wozniak recalled. I thought that there was no way I could do it, but Steve made me sure that I could. So he stayed up 4 nights in a row and did it. During the day at HP, Wozniak would sketch out his design on paper. Then, after a fast food meal, he would go right to Atari and stay all night. As Wozniak churned out the design, Jobs sat on a bench to his left implementing it by wire wrapping the chips onto a breadboard. While Steve was breadboarding, I spent time playing my favorite game ever, which was the auto racing game Grand Track 10, Wozniak said. Astonishingly, they were able to get the job done in 4 days, and Wozniak used only 45 chips. Recollections differ, but by most accounts Jobs simply gave Wozniak half of the base fee and not the bonus Bushnell paid for saving 5 chips. It would be another 10 years before Wozniak discovered, by being shown the tale in a book on the history of Atari titled Zap, that Jobs had been paid this bonus. I think that Steve needed the money, and he just didn't tell me the truth, Wozniak later said. When he talks about it now, there are long pauses, and he admits that it causes him pain. I wish he had just been honest. If he had told me he needed the money, he should have known I would have just given it to him. He was a friend. You help your friends. To Wozniak, it showed a fundamental difference in their characters. Ethics always mattered to me, and I still don't understand why he would have gotten paid one thing and told me he'd gotten paid another, he said. But, you know, people are different. When Jobs learned this story was published, he called Wozniak to deny it. He told me that he didn't remember doing it, and that if he did something like that he would remember it, so he probably didn't do it, Wozniak recalled. When I asked Jobs directly, he became unusually quiet and hesitant. I don't know where that allegation comes from, he said. I gave him half the money I ever got. That's how I've always been with Woz. I mean, Woz stopped working in 1978. He never did 1 ounce of work after 1978. And yet he got exactly the same shares of Apple stock that I did. Is it possible that memories are muddled and that Jobs did not, in fact, shortchange Wozniak? There's a chance that my memory is all wrong and messed up, Wozniak told me, but after a pause he reconsidered. But no. I remember the details of this one, the $350 check. He confirmed his memory with Nolan Bushnell and Al Alcorn. I remember talking about the bonus money to Woz, and he was upset, Bushnell said. I said yes, there was a bonus for each chip they saved, and he just shook his head and then clucked his tongue. Whatever the truth, Wozniak later insisted that it was not worth rehashing. Jobs is a complex person, he said, and being manipulative is just the darker facet of the traits that make him successful. Wozniak would never have been that way, but as he points out, he also could never have built Apple. I would rather let it pass, he said when I pressed the point. It's not something I want to judge Steve by. The Atari experience helped shape Jobs' approach to business and design. He appreciated the user-friendliness of Atari's insert quarter Avoidklingen's games. That simplicity rubbed off on him and made him a very focused product person, said Ron Wayne. Jobs also absorbed some of Bushnell's take no prisoners attitude. Nolan wouldn't take no for an answer, according to Alcorn, and this was Steve's first impression of how things got done. Nolan was never abusive, like Steve sometimes is. But he had the same driven attitude. It made me cringe, but damn it, it got things done. In that way Nolan was a mentor for Jobs. Bushnell agreed. There is something indefinable in an entrepreneur, and I saw that in Steve, he said. He was interested not just in engineering, but also the business aspects. I taught him that if you act like you can do something, then it will work. I told him, pretend to be completely in control and people will assume that you are. Chapter 5 The Apple I Turn On, Boot Up, Jack In, Daniel Kotke and Jobs with the Apple I at the Atlantic City Computer Fair, 1976 Machines of Loving Grace in San Francisco and the Santa Clara Valley. During the late 1960s, various cultural currents flowed together. There was the technology revolution that began with the growth of military contractors and soon included electronics firms, microchip makers, video game designers, and computer companies. There was a hacker subculture, filled with wireheads, frakers, cyberpunks, hobbyists, and just plain geeks, that included engineers who didn't conform to the HP mold and their kids who weren't attuned to the wavelengths of the subdivisions. There were quasi-academic groups doing studies on the effects of LSD. Participants included Doug Engelbart of the Augmentation Research Center in Palo Alto, who later helped develop the computer mouse and graphical user interfaces, and Ken Kesey, who celebrated the drug with music and light shows featuring a house band that became the Grateful Dead. There was the hippie movement, born out of the Bay Area's Beat Generation, and the rebellious political activists, born out of the free speech movement at Berkeley. Overlaid on it all were various self-fulfillment movements pursuing paths to personal enlightenment. Zen and Hinduism, meditation and yoga, primal scream and sensory deprivation, Esalen and Est. This fusion of flower power and processor power, enlightenment and technology, was embodied by Steve Jobs as he meditated in the mornings, audited physics classes at Stanford, worked nights at Atari, and dreamed of starting his own business. There was just something going on here, he said, looking back at the time and place. The best music came from here, the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Joan Baez, Janis Joplin, and so did the integrated circuit, and things like the Whole Earth catalog. Initially the technologists and the hippies did not interface well. Many in the counterculture saw computers as ominous and Orwellian, the province of the Pentagon and the power structure. In The Myth of the Machine, the historian Lewis Mumford warned that computers were sucking away our freedom and destroying life-enhancing values. An injunction on punch cards of the period, do not fold, spindle or mutilate, became an ironic phrase of the anti-war left. But by the early 1970s a shift was underway. Computing went from being dismissed as a tool of bureaucratic control to being embraced as a symbol of individual expression and liberation. John Markoff wrote in his study of the counterculture's convergence with the computer industry, What the Dormouse Said. It was an ethos lyrically expressed in Richard Brautigan's 1967 poem, All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, and the cyberdelic fusion was certified when Timothy Leary declared that personal computers had become the new LSD and years later revised his famous mantra to proclaim, turn on, boot up, jack in. The musician Bono, who later became a friend of Jobs, often discussed with him why those immersed in the rock drugs rebel counterculture of the Bay Area ended up helping to create the personal computer industry. The people who invented the 21st century were pot-smoking, sandal-wearing hippies from the West Coast like Steve, because they saw differently, he said. The hierarchical systems of the East Coast, England, Germany, and Japan do not encourage this different thinking. The 60s produced an anarchic mindset that is great for imagining a world not yet in existence. One person who encouraged the denizens of the counterculture to make common cause with the hackers was Stuart Brand. A puckish visionary who generated fun and ideas over many decades, Brand was a participant in one of the early 60s LSD studies in Palo Alto. He joined with his fellow subject Ken Kesey to produce the Acid Celebrating Trips Festival, appeared in the opening scene of Tom Wolfe's The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, and worked with Doug Engelbart to create a seminal sound and light presentation of new technologies called the Mother of All Demos. Most of our generation scorned computers as the embodiment of centralized control, Brand later noted. But a tiny contingent, later called hackers, embraced computers and set about transforming them into tools of liberation. That turned out to be the true royal road to the future. Brand ran the Whole Earth Truck Store, which began as a roving truck that sold useful tools and educational materials, and in 1968 he decided to extend its reach with the Whole Earth catalog. On its first cover was the famous picture of Earth taken from space. Its subtitle was, Access to Tools. The underlying philosophy was that technology could be our friend. Brand wrote on the first page of the first edition, a realm of intimate, personal power is developing, power of the individual to conduct his own education, find his own inspiration, shape his own environment, and share his adventure with whoever is interested. Tools that aid this process are sought and promoted by the Whole Earth catalog. Buckminster Fuller followed with a poem that began, I see God in the instruments and mechanisms that work reliably. Jobs became a Whole Earth fan. He was particularly taken by the final issue, which came out in 1971, when he was still in high school, and he brought it with him to college and then to the All-One farm. On the back cover of their final issue, Jobs recalled, was a photograph of an early morning country road, the kind you might find yourself hitchhiking on if you were so adventurous. Beneath it were the words, stay hungry. Stay foolish. Brand sees Jobs as one of the purest embodiments of the cultural mix that the catalog sought to celebrate. Steve is right at the nexus of the counterculture and technology, he said. He got the notion of tools for human use. Brand's catalog was published with the help of the Portola Institute, a foundation dedicated to the fledgling field of computer education. The foundation also helped launch the People's Computer Company, which was not a company at all but a newsletter and organization with the motto, Computer Power to the People. There were occasional Wednesday night potluck dinners, and two of the regulars, Gordon French and Fred Moore, decided to create a more formal club where news about personal electronics could be shared. They were energized by the arrival of the January 1975 issue of Popular Mechanics, which had on its cover the first personal computer kit, the Altair. The Altair wasn't much, just a $495 pile of parts that had to be soldered to a board that would then do little, but for hobbyists and hackers it heralded the dawn of a new era. Bill Gates and Paul Allen read the magazine and started working on a version of BASIC, an easy-to-use programming language, for the Altair. It also caught the attention of Jobs and Wozniak. And when an Altair kit arrived at the People's Computer Company, it became the centerpiece for the first meeting of the club that French and Moore had decided to launch. The Homebrew Computer Club. The group became known as the Homebrew Computer Club, and it encapsulated the whole Earth fusion between the counterculture and technology. It would become to the personal computer era something akin to what the Turk's Head Coffee House was to the age of Dr. Johnson, a place where ideas were exchanged and disseminated. Moore wrote the flyer for the first meeting, held on March 5, 1975, in French's Menlo Park garage. Are you building your own computer? Terminal, TV, typewriter, it asked. If so, you might like to come to a gathering of people with like-minded interests. Alan Baum spotted the flyer on the HP bulletin board and called Wozniak, who agreed to go with him. That night turned out to be one of the most important nights of my life, Wozniak recalled. About 30 other people showed up, spilling out of French's open garage door, and they took turns describing their interests. Wozniak, who later admitted to being extremely nervous, said he liked video games, pay movies for hotels, scientific calculator design, and TV terminal design, according to the minutes prepared by Moore. There was a demonstration of the new Altair, but more important to Wozniak was seeing the specification sheet for a microprocessor. As he thought about the microprocessor, a chip that had an entire central processing unit on it, he had an insight. He had been designing a terminal, with a keyboard and monitor, that would connect to a distant minicomputer. Using a microprocessor, he could put some of the capacity of the minicomputer inside the terminal itself, so it could become a small standalone computer on a desktop. It was an enduring idea: keyboard, screen, and computer all in one integrated personal package. This whole vision of a personal computer just popped into my head, he said. That night, I started to sketch out on paper what would later become known as the Apple I. At first he planned to use the same microprocessor that was in the Altair, an Intel 8080. But each of those cost almost more than my monthly rent, so he looked for an alternative. He found one in the Motorola 6800, which a friend at HP was able to get for $40 a piece. Then he discovered a chip made by MOS Technologies that was electronically the same but cost only $20. It would make his machine affordable, but it would carry a long-term cost. Intel's chips ended up becoming the industry standard, which would haunt Apple when its computers were incompatible with it. After work each day, Wozniak would go home for a TV dinner and then return to HP to moonlight on his computer. He spread out the parts in his cubicle, figured out their placement, and soldered them onto his motherboard. Then he began writing the software that would get the microprocessor to display images on the screen. Because he could not afford to pay for computer time, he wrote the code by hand. After a couple of months he was ready to test it. I typed a few keys on the keyboard and I was shocked. The letters were displayed on the screen. It was Sunday, June 29, 1975, a milestone for the personal computer. It was the first time in history, Wozniak later said, anyone had typed a character on a keyboard and seen it show up on their own computer's screen right in front of them. Jobs was impressed. He peppered Wozniak with questions. Could the computer ever be networked? Was it possible to add a disk for memory storage? He also began to help Woz get components. Particularly important were the dynamic random access memory chips. Jobs made a few calls and was able to score some from Intel for free. Steve is just that sort of person, said Wozniak. I mean, he knew how to talk to a sales representative. I could never have done that. I'm too shy. Jobs began to accompany Wozniak to homebrew meetings, carrying the TV monitor and helping to set things up. The meetings now attracted more than 100 enthusiasts and had been moved to the auditorium of the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. Presiding with a pointer in a freeform manner was Lee Felsenstein, another embodiment of the merger between the world of computing and the counterculture. He was an engineering school dropout, a participant in the free speech movement, and an anti-war activist. He had written for the alternative newspaper Berkeley Barb and then gone back to being a computer engineer. Woz was usually too shy to talk in the meetings, but people would gather around his machine afterward, and he would proudly show off his progress. Moore had tried to instill in the homebrew an ethos of swapping and sharing rather than commerce. The theme of the club, Woz said, was, give to help others. It was an expression of the hacker ethic that information should be free and all authority mistrusted. I designed the Apple I because I wanted to give it away for free to other people, said Wozniak. This was not an outlook that Bill Gates embraced. After he and Paul Allen had completed their basic interpreter for the Altair, Gates was appalled that members of the homebrew were making copies of it and sharing it without paying him. So he wrote what would become a famous letter to the club. As the majority of hobbyists must be aware, most of you steal your software. Is this fair? One thing you do is prevent good software from being written. Who can afford to do professional work for nothing? I would appreciate letters from anyone who wants to pay up. Steve Jobs, similarly, did not embrace the notion that Wozniak's creations, be it a blue box or a computer, wanted to be free. So he convinced Wozniak to stop giving away copies of his schematics. Most people didn't have time to build it themselves anyway, Jobs argued. Why don't we build and sell printed circuit boards to them? It was an example of their symbiosis. Every time I designed something great, Steve would find a way to make money for us, said Wozniak. Wozniak admitted that he would have never thought of doing that on his own. It never crossed my mind to sell computers. It was Steve who said, let's hold them in the air and sell a few. Jobs worked out a plan to pay a guy he knew at Atari to draw the circuit boards and then print up 50 or so. That would cost about $1,000, plus the fee to the designer. They could sell them for $40 a piece and perhaps clear a profit of $700. Wozniak was dubious that they could sell them all. I didn't see how we would make our money back, he recalled. He was already in trouble with his landlord for bouncing checks and now had to pay each month in cash. Jobs knew how to appeal to Wozniak. He didn't argue that they were sure to make money, but instead that they would have a fun adventure. Even if we lose our money, we'll have a company, said Jobs as they were driving in his Volkswagen bus. For once in our lives, we'll have a company. This was enticing to Wozniak, even more than any prospect of getting rich. He recalled, I was excited to think about us like that. To be two best friends starting a company. Wow. I knew right then that I'd do it. How could I not? In order to raise the money they needed, Wozniak sold his HP 65 calculator for $500, though the buyer ended up stiffing him for half of that. For his part, Jobs sold his Volkswagen bus for $1,500. But the person who bought it came to find him 2 weeks later and said the engine had broken down, and Jobs agreed to pay for half of the repairs. Despite these little setbacks, they now had, with their own small savings thrown in, about $1,300 in working capital, the design for a product, and a plan. They would start their own computer company. Apple is born now that they had decided to start a business, they needed a name. Jobs had gone for another visit to the All-One farm, where he had been pruning the Gravenstein apple trees, and Wozniak picked him up at the airport. On the ride down to Los Altos, they bandied around options. They considered some typical tech words, such as matrix, and some neologisms, such as executech, and some straightforward boring names, like Personal Computers Inc. The deadline for deciding was the next day, when Jobs wanted to start filing the papers. Finally Jobs proposed Apple Computer. I was in one of my fruitarian diets, he explained. I had just come back from the Apple farm. It sounded fun, spirited, and not intimidating. Apple took the edge off the word, computer. Plus, it would get us ahead of Atari in the phone book. He told Wozniak that if a better name did not hit them by the next afternoon, they would just stick with Apple. And they did. Apple. It was a smart choice. The word instantly signaled friendliness and simplicity. It managed to be both slightly offbeat and as normal as a slice of pie. There was a whiff of counterculture, back to nature earthiness to it, yet nothing could be more American. And the two words together, Apple Computer, provided an amusing disjuncture. It doesn't quite make sense, said Mike Markula, who soon thereafter became the first chairman of the new company. So it forces your brain to dwell on it. Apple and computers, that doesn't go together. So it helped us grow brand awareness. Wozniak was not yet ready to commit full-time. He was an HP company man at heart, or so he thought, and he wanted to keep his day job there. Jobs realized he needed an ally to help corral Wozniak and adjudicate if there was a disagreement. So he enlisted his friend Ron Wayne, the middle-aged engineer at Atari who had once started a slot machine company. Wayne knew that it would not be easy to make Wozniak quit HP, nor was it necessary right away. Instead, the key was to convince him that his computer designs would be owned by the Apple partnership. Woz had a parental attitude toward the circuits he developed, and he wanted to be able to use them in other applications or let HP use them, Wayne said. Jobs and I realized that these circuits would be the core of Apple. We spent 2 hours in a roundtable discussion at my apartment, and I was able to get Woz to accept this. His argument was that a great engineer would be remembered only if he teamed with a great marketer, and this required him to commit his designs to the partnership. Jobs was so impressed and grateful that he offered Wayne a 10% stake in the new partnership, turning him into a tie-breaker if Jobs and Wozniak disagreed over an issue. They were very different, but they made a powerful team, said Wayne. Jobs at times seemed to be driven by demons, while Woz seemed a naive who was toyed with by angels. Jobs had a bravado that helped him get things done, occasionally by manipulating people. He could be charismatic, even mesmerizing, but also cold and brutal. Wozniak, in contrast, was shy and socially awkward, which made him seem childishly sweet. Woz is very bright in some areas, but he's almost like a savant, since he was so stunted when it came to dealing with people he didn't know, said Jobs. We were a good pair. It helped that Jobs was awed by Wozniak's engineering wizardry, and Wozniak was awed by Jobs's business drive. I never wanted to deal with people and step on toes, but Steve could call up people he didn't know and make them do things, Wozniak recalled. He could be rough on people he didn't think were smart, but he never treated me rudely, even in later years when maybe I couldn't answer a question as well as he wanted. Even after Wozniak became convinced that his new computer design should become the property of the Apple partnership, he felt that he had to offer it first to HP, since he was working there. I believed it was my duty to tell HP about what I had designed while working for them. That was the right thing and the ethical thing. So he demonstrated it to his managers in the spring of 1976. The senior executive at the meeting was impressed, and seemed torn, but he finally said it was not something that HP could develop. It was a hobbyist product, at least for now, and didn't fit into the company's high-quality market segments. I was disappointed, Wozniak recalled, but now I was free to enter into the Apple partnership. On April 1, 1976, Jobs and Wozniak went to Wayne's apartment in Mountain View to draw up the partnership agreement. Wayne said he had some experience writing in legalese, so he composed the 3-page document himself. His legalese got the better of him. Paragraphs began with various flourishes, be it noted herewith. Be it further noted herewith. Now the in consideration of the respective assignments of interests. Quote. But the division of shares and profits was clear, 45% minus 45% minus 10%, and it was stipulated that any expenditures of more than $100 would require agreement of at least 2 of the partners. Also, the responsibilities were spelled out. Wozniak shall assume both general and major responsibility for the conduct of electrical engineering, Jobs shall assume general responsibility for electrical engineering and marketing, and Wayne shall assume major responsibility for mechanical engineering and documentation. Jobs signed in lowercase script, Wozniak in careful cursive, and Wayne in an illegible squiggle. Wayne then got cold feet. As Jobs started planning to borrow and spend more money, he recalled the failure of his own company. He didn't want to go through that again. Jobs and Wozniak had no personal assets, but Wayne, who worried about a global financial Armageddon, kept gold coins hidden in his mattress. Because they had structured Apple as a simple partnership rather than a corporation, the partners would be personally liable for the debts, and Wayne was afraid potential creditors would go after him. So he returned to the Santa Clara County office just 11 days later with a statement of withdrawal and an amendment to the partnership agreement. By virtue of a reassessment of understandings by and between all parties, it began, Wayne shall hereinafter cease to function in the status of partner. It noted that in payment for his 10% of the company, he received $800, and shortly afterward $1,500 more. Had he stayed on and kept his 10% stake, at the end of 2010 it would have been worth approximately $2.6 billion. Instead he was then living alone in a small home in Pahrump, Nevada, where he played the penny slot machines and lived off his Social Security check. He later claimed he had no regrets. I made the best decision for me at the time. Both of them were real whirlwinds, and I knew my stomach and it wasn't ready for such a ride. Jobs and Wozniak took the stage together for a presentation to the Homebrew Computer Club shortly after they signed Apple into existence. Wozniak held up one of their newly produced circuit boards and described the microprocessor, the 8 kilobytes of memory, and the version of BASIC he had written. He also emphasized what he called the main thing, a human typable keyboard instead of a stupid, cryptic front panel with a bunch of lights and switches. Then it was Jobs' turn. He pointed out that the Apple, unlike the Altair, had all the essential components built in. Then he challenged them with a question. How much would people be willing to pay for such a wonderful machine? He was trying to get them to see the amazing value of the Apple. It was a rhetorical flourish he would use at product presentations over the ensuing decades. The audience was not very impressed. The Apple had a cut-rate microprocessor, not the Intel 8080. But one important person stayed behind to hear more. His name was Paul Terrell, and in 1975 he had opened a computer store, which he dubbed the Byte Shop, on Camino Real in Menlo Park. Now, a year later, he had 3 stores and visions of building a national chain. Jobs was thrilled to give him a private demo. Take a look at this, he said. You're going to like what you see. Terrell was impressed enough to hand Jobs and Woz his card. Keep in touch, he said. I'm keeping in touch, Jobs announced the next day when he walked barefoot into the Byte Shop. He made the sale. Terrell agreed to order 50 computers. But there was a condition. He didn't want just $50 printed circuit boards, for which customers would then have to buy all the chips and do the assembly. That might appeal to a few hardcore hobbyists, but not to most customers. Instead he wanted the boards to be fully assembled. For that he was willing to pay about $500 a piece, cash on delivery. Jobs immediately called Wozniak at HP. Are you sitting down? He asked. Wozniak said he wasn't. Jobs nevertheless proceeded to give him the news. I was shocked, just completely shocked, Wozniak recalled. I will never forget that moment. Gates and Jobs when orbits intersect. Jobs and Gates, 1991. The Macintosh partnership in astronomy. A binary system occurs when the orbits of 2 stars are linked because of their gravitational interaction. There have been analogous situations in history, when an era is shaped by the relationship and rivalry of 2 orbiting superstars, Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr in 20th-century physics, for example, or Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton in early American governance. For the first 30 years of the personal computer age, beginning in the late 1970s, the defining binary star system was composed of two high-energy college dropouts both born in 1955. Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, despite their similar ambitions at the confluence of technology and business, had very different personalities and backgrounds. Gates's father was a prominent Seattle lawyer, his mother a civic leader on a variety of prestigious boards. He became a tech geek at the area's finest private school, Lakeside High, but he was never a rebel, hippie, spiritual seeker, or member of the counterculture. Instead of a blue box to rip off the phone company, Gates created for his school a program for scheduling classes, which helped him get into ones with the right girls, and a car counting program for local traffic engineers. He went to Harvard, and when he decided to drop out it was not to find enlightenment with an Indian guru but to start a computer software company. Gates was good at computer coding, unlike Jobs, and his mind was more practical, disciplined, and abundant in analytic processing power. Jobs was more intuitive and romantic and had a greater instinct for making technology usable, design delightful, and interfaces friendly. He had a passion for perfection, which made him fiercely demanding, and he managed by charisma and scattershot intensity. Gates was more methodical. He held tightly scheduled product review meetings where he would cut to the heart of issues with lapidary skill. Both could be rude, but with Gates, who early in his career seemed to have a typical geek's flirtation with the fringes of the Asperger's scale, the cutting behavior tended to be less personal, based more on intellectual incisiveness than emotional callousness. Jobs would stare at people with a burning, wounding intensity. Gates sometimes had trouble making eye contact, but he was fundamentally humane. Each one thought he was smarter than the other one, but Steve generally treated Bill as someone who was slightly inferior, especially in matters of taste and style, said Andy Hertzfeld. Bill looked down on Steve because he couldn't actually program. From the beginning of their relationship, Gates was fascinated by Jobs and slightly envious of his mesmerizing effect on people. But he also found him fundamentally odd and weirdly flawed as a human being, and he was put off by Jobs's rudeness and his tendency to be either in the mode of saying you were shit or trying to seduce you. For his part, Jobs found Gates unnervingly narrow. He'd be a broader guy if he had dropped acid once or gone off to an ashram when he was younger, Jobs once declared. Their differences in personality and character would lead them to opposite sides of what would become the fundamental divide in the digital age. Jobs was a perfectionist who craved control and indulged in the uncompromising temperament of an artist. He and Apple became the exemplars of a digital strategy that tightly integrated hardware, software, and content into a seamless package. Gates was a smart, calculating, and pragmatic analyst of business and technology. He was open to licensing Microsoft's operating system and software to a variety of manufacturers. After 30 years, Gates would develop a grudging respect for Jobs. He really never knew much about technology, but he had an amazing instinct for what works, he said. But Jobs never reciprocated by fully appreciating Gates's real strengths. Bill is basically unimaginative and has never invented anything, which is why I think he's more comfortable now in philanthropy than technology, Jobs said, unfairly. He just shamelessly ripped off other people's ideas. When the Macintosh was first being developed, Jobs went up to visit Gates at his office near Seattle. Microsoft had written some applications for the Apple II, including a spreadsheet program called Multiplan, and Jobs wanted to excite Gates & Co. about doing even more for the forthcoming Macintosh. Sitting in Gates's conference room, Jobs spun an enticing vision of a computer for the masses, with a friendly interface, which would be churned out by the millions in an automated California factory. His description of the dream factory sucking in the California silicon components and turning out finished Macintoshes caused the Microsoft team to code-name the project, SAND. They even reverse-engineered it into an acronym, for Steve's Amazing New Device. Gates had launched Microsoft by writing a version of BASIC, a programming language, for the Altair. Jobs wanted Microsoft to write a version of BASIC for the Macintosh, because Wozniak, despite much prodding by Jobs, had never enhanced his version of the Apple II's BASIC to handle floating-point numbers. In addition, Jobs wanted Microsoft to write application software, such as word processing and spreadsheet programs, for the Macintosh. At the time, Jobs was a king and Gates still a courtier. In 1982 Apple's annual sales were $1 billion, while Microsoft's were a mere $32 million. Gates signed on to do graphical versions of a new spreadsheet called Excel, a word processing program called Word, and BASIC. Gates frequently went to Cupertino for demonstrations of the Macintosh operating system, and he was not very impressed. I remember the first time we went down, Steve had this app where it was just things bouncing around on the screen, he said. That was the only app that ran. Gates was also put off by Jobs' attitude. It was kind of a weird seduction visit, where Steve was saying, "We don't really need you and we're doing this great thing, and it's under the cover." He's in his Steve Jobs sales mode, but kind of the sales mode that also says, "I don't need you, but I might let you be involved." The Macintosh pirates found Gates hard to take. You could tell that Bill Gates was not a very good listener. He couldn't bear to have anyone explain how something worked to him. He had to leap ahead instead and guess about how he thought it would work, Hertzfeld recalled. They showed him how the Macintosh's cursor moved smoothly across the screen without flickering. "What kind of hardware do you use to draw the cursor?" Gates asked. Hertzfeld, who took great pride that they could achieve their functionality solely using software, replied, "We don't have any special hardware for it." Gates insisted that it was necessary to have special hardware to move the cursor that way. So what do you say to somebody like that? Bruce Horn, one of the Macintosh engineers, later said. It made it clear to me that Gates was not the kind of person that would understand or appreciate the elegance of a Macintosh. Despite their mutual wariness, both teams were excited by the prospect that Microsoft would create graphical software for the Macintosh that would take personal computing into a new realm, and they went to dinner at a fancy restaurant to celebrate. Microsoft soon dedicated a large team to the task. "We had more people working on the Mac than he did," Gates said. He had about 14 or 15 people. We had like 20 people. We really bet our life on it. And even though Jobs thought that they didn't exhibit much taste, the Microsoft programmers were persistent. They came out with applications that were terrible, Jobs recalled, but they kept at it and they made them better. Eventually Jobs became so enamored of Excel that he made a secret bargain with Gates. If Microsoft would make Excel exclusively for the Macintosh for 2 years, and not make a version for IBM PCs, then Jobs would shut down his team working on a version of BASIC for the Macintosh and instead indefinitely license Microsoft's BASIC. Gates smartly took the deal, which infuriated the Apple team whose project got cancelled and gave Microsoft a lever in future negotiations. For the time being, Gates and Jobs forged a bond. That summer they went to a conference hosted by the industry analyst Ben Rosen at a Playboy Club retreat in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, where nobody knew about the graphical interfaces that Apple was developing. Everybody was acting like the IBM PC was everything, which was nice, but Steve and I were kind of smiling that, "Hey, we've got something," Gates recalled. "And he's kind of leaking," but nobody actually caught on. Gates became a regular at Apple retreats. "I went to every luau," said Gates. "I was part of the crew." Gates enjoyed his frequent visits to Cupertino, where he got to watch Jobs interact erratically with his employees and display his obsessions. Steve was in his ultimate Pied Piper mode, proclaiming how the Mac will change the world and overworking people like mad, with incredible tensions and complex personal relationships. Sometimes Jobs would begin on a high, then lapse into sharing his fears with Gates. We'd go down Friday night, have dinner, and Steve would just be promoting that everything is great. Then the second day, without fail, he'd be kind of, "Oh shit, is this thing going to sell? Oh god, I have to raise the price, I'm sorry I did that to you, and my team is a bunch of idiots." Gates saw Jobs' reality distortion field at play when the Xerox Star was launched. At a joint team dinner one Friday night, Jobs asked Gates how many stars had been sold thus far. Gates said 600. The next day, in front of Gates and the whole team, Jobs said that 300 stars had been sold, forgetting that Gates had just told everyone it was actually 600. So his whole team starts looking at me like, "Are you going to tell him that he's full of shit?" Gates recalled. And in that case I didn't take the bait. On another occasion Jobs and his team were visiting Microsoft and having dinner at the Seattle Tennis Club. Jobs launched into a sermon about how the Macintosh and its software would be so easy to use that there would be no manuals. It was like anybody who ever thought that there would be a manual for any Mac application was the greatest idiot, said Gates. And we were like, does he really mean it? Should we not tell him that we have people who are actually working on manuals? After a while the relationship became bumpier. The original plan was to have some of the Microsoft applications, such as Excel, Chart, and File, carry the Apple logo and come bundled with the purchase of a Macintosh. We were going to get $10 per app, per machine, said Gates. But this arrangement upset competing software makers. In addition, it seemed that some of Microsoft's programs might be late. So Jobs invoked a provision in his deal with Microsoft and decided not to bundle its software. Microsoft would have to scramble to distribute its software as products sold directly to consumers. Gates went along without much complaint. He was already getting used to the fact that, as he put it, Jobs could play fast and loose, and he suspected that the unbundling would actually help Microsoft. We could make more money selling our software separately, Gates said. It works better that way if you're willing to think you're going to have reasonable market share. Microsoft ended up making its software for various other platforms, and it began to give priority to the IBM PC version of Microsoft Word rather than the Macintosh version. In the end, Jobs' decision to back out of the bundling deal hurt Apple more than it did Microsoft. When Excel for the Macintosh was released, Jobs and Gates unveiled it together at a press dinner at New York's Tavern on the Green. Asked if Microsoft would make a version of it for IBM PCs, Gates did not reveal the bargain he had made with Jobs but merely answered that, in time, that might happen. Jobs took the microphone. I'm sure, in time, we'll all be dead, he joked. The Battle of the GUI. At that time, Microsoft was producing an operating system, known as DOS, which it licensed to IBM and compatible computers. It was based on an old-fashioned command line interface that confronted users with surly little prompts such as C greater than. As Jobs and his team began to work closely with Microsoft, they grew worried that it would copy Macintosh's graphical user interface. Andy Hertzfeld noticed that his contact at Microsoft was asking detailed questions about how the Macintosh operating system worked. I told Steve that I suspected that Microsoft was going to clone the Mac, he recalled. They were right to worry. Gates believed that graphical interfaces were the future, and that Microsoft had just as much right as Apple did to copy what had been developed at Xerox PARC. As he freely admitted later, we sort of say, hey, we believe in graphics interfaces, we saw the Xerox Alto too. In their original deal, Jobs had convinced Gates to agree that Microsoft would not create graphical software for anyone other than Apple until a year after the Macintosh shipped in January 1983. Unfortunately for Apple, it did not provide for the possibility that the Macintosh launch would be delayed for a year. So Gates was within his rights when, in November 1983, he revealed that Microsoft planned to develop a new operating system for IBM PCs featuring a graphical interface with windows, icons, and a mouse for point-and-click navigation. It would be called Windows. Gates hosted a Jobs-like product announcement, the most lavish thus far in Microsoft's history, at the Helmsley Palace Hotel in New York. Jobs was furious. He knew there was little he could do about it. Microsoft's deal with Apple not to do competing graphical software was running out, but he lashed out nonetheless. Get Gates down here immediately, he ordered Mike Boich, who was Apple's evangelist to other software companies. Gates arrived, alone and willing to discuss things with Jobs. He called me down to get pissed off at me, Gates recalled. I went down to Cupertino, like a command performance. I told him, we're doing Windows. I said to him, we're betting our company on graphical interfaces. They met in Jobs' conference room, where Gates found himself surrounded by 10 Apple employees who were eager to watch their boss assail him. Jobs didn't disappoint his troops. You're ripping us off, he shouted. I trusted you, and now you're stealing from us. Hertzfeld recalled that Gates just sat there coolly, looking Steve in the eye, before hurling back, in his squeaky voice, what became a classic zinger. Well, Steve, I think there's more than one way of looking at it. I think it's more like we both had this rich neighbor named Xerox and I broke into his house to steal the TV set and found out that you had already stolen it. Gates's two-day visit provoked the full range of Jobs' emotional responses and manipulation techniques. It also made clear that the Apple-Microsoft symbiosis had become a scorpion dance, with both sides circling warily, knowing that a sting by either could cause problems for both. After the confrontation in the conference room, Gates quietly gave Jobs a private demo of what was being planned for Windows. Steve didn't know what to say, Gates recalled. He could either say, "Oh, this is a violation of something," but he didn't. He chose to say, "Oh, it's actually really a piece of shit." Gates was thrilled, because it gave him a chance to calm Jobs down for a moment. I said, "Yes, it's a nice little piece of shit." So Jobs went through a gamut of other emotions. During the course of this meeting, "He's just ruder than shit," Gates said. "And then there's a part where he's almost crying, like, oh, just give me a chance to get this thing off." Gates responded by becoming very calm. "I'm good at when people are emotional, I'm kind of less emotional." As he often did when he wanted to have a serious conversation, Jobs suggested they go on a long walk. They trekked the streets of Cupertino, back and forth to De Anza College, stopping at a diner and then walking some more. "We had to take a walk, which is not one of my management techniques," Gates said. That was when he began saying things like, okay, but don't make it too much like what we're doing." As it turned out, Microsoft wasn't able to get Windows 1.0 ready for shipping until the fall of 1985. Even then, it was a shoddy product. It lacked the elegance of the Macintosh interface, and it had tiled windows rather than the magical clipping of overlapping windows that Bill Atkinson had devised. Reviewers ridiculed it and consumers spurned it. Nevertheless, as is often the case with Microsoft products, persistence eventually made Windows better and then dominant. Jobs never got over his anger. "They just ripped us off completely, because Gates has no shame," Jobs told me almost 30 years later. Upon hearing this, Gates responded, "If he believes that, he really has entered into one of his own reality distortion fields." In a legal sense, Gates was right, as courts over the years have subsequently ruled. And on a practical level, he had a strong case as well. Even though Apple made a deal for the right to use what it saw at Xerox PARC, it was inevitable that other companies would develop similar graphical interfaces. As Apple found out, the look and feel of a computer interface design is a hard thing to protect. And yet Jobs' dismay was understandable. Apple had been more innovative, imaginative, elegant in execution, and brilliant in design. But even though Microsoft created a crudely copied series of products, it would end up winning the war of operating systems. This exposed an aesthetic flaw in how the universe worked. The best and most innovative products don't always win. A decade later, this truism caused Jobs to let loose a rant that was somewhat arrogant and over the top, but also had a whiff of truth to it. "The only problem with Microsoft is they just have no taste. They have absolutely no taste," he said. "I don't mean that in a small way. I mean that in a big way, in the sense that they don't think of original ideas and they don't bring much culture into their product." Chapter 17 Icarus What Goes Up? Flying High. The launch of the Macintosh in January 1984 propelled Jobs into an even higher orbit of celebrity, as was evident during a trip to Manhattan he took at the time. He went to a party that Yoko Ono threw for her son, Sean Lennon, and gave the 9-year-old a Macintosh. The boy loved it. The artists Andy Warhol and Keith Haring were there, and they were so enthralled by what they could create with the machine that the contemporary art world almost took an ominous turn. "I drew a circle," Warhol exclaimed proudly after using QuickDraw. Warhol insisted that Jobs take a computer to Mick Jagger. When Jobs arrived at the rock star's townhouse, Jagger seemed baffled. He didn't quite know who Jobs was. Later Jobs told his team, "I think he was on drugs. Either that or he's brain damaged." Jagger's daughter Jade, however, took to the computer immediately and started drawing with MacPaint, so Jobs gave it to her instead. He bought the top-floor duplex apartment that he'd shown Scully in the San Remo on Manhattan's Central Park West and hired James Fried of I.M. Pei's firm to renovate it, but he never moved in. He would later sell it to Bono for $15 million. He also bought an old Spanish colonial-style 14-bedroom mansion in Woodside, in the hills above Palo Alto, that had been built by a copper baron, which he moved into but never got around to furnishing. At Apple his status revived. Instead of seeking ways to curtail Jobs' authority, Scully gave him more. The Lisa and Macintosh divisions were folded together, with Jobs in charge. He was flying high, but this did not serve to make him more mellow. Indeed, there was a memorable display of his brutal honesty when he stood in front of the combined Lisa and Macintosh teams to describe how they would be merged. His Macintosh group leaders would get all of the top positions, he said, and a quarter of the Lisa staff would be laid off. "You guys failed," he said, looking directly at those who had worked on the Lisa. "Your A-B team. B players. Too many people here are B or C players, so today we are releasing some of you to have the opportunity to work at our sister companies here in the Valley. Bill Atkinson, who had worked on both teams, thought it was not only callous, but unfair. These people had worked really hard and were brilliant engineers, he said. But Jobs had latched onto what he believed was a key management lesson from his Macintosh experience. You have to be ruthless if you want to build a team of A players. It's too easy, as a team grows, to put up with a few B players, and they then attract a few more B players, and soon you will even have some C players, he recalled. The Macintosh experience taught me that A players like to work only with other A players, which means you can't indulge B players. For the time being, Jobs and Scully were able to convince themselves that their friendship was still strong. They professed their fondness so effusively and often that they sounded like high school sweethearts at a Hallmark card display. The first anniversary of Scully's arrival came in May 1984, and to celebrate Jobs lured him to a dinner party at Le Mouton Noir, an elegant restaurant in the hills southwest of Cupertino. To Scully's surprise, Jobs had gathered the Apple board, its top managers, and even some East Coast investors. As they all congratulated him during cocktails, Scully recalled, a beaming Steve stood in the background, nodding his head up and down and wearing a Cheshire cat smile on his face. Jobs began the dinner with a fulsome toast. The happiest 2 days for me were when Macintosh shipped and when John Scully agreed to join Apple, he said. This has been the greatest year I've ever had in my whole life, because I've learned so much from John. He then presented Scully with a montage of memorabilia from the year. In response, Scully effused about the joys of being Jobs' partner for the past year, and he concluded with a line that, for different reasons, everyone at the table found memorable. Apple has one leader, he said, Steve and me. He looked across the room, caught Jobs' eye, and watched him smile. It was as if we were communicating with each other, Scully recalled. But he also noticed that Arthur Rock and some of the others were looking quizzical, perhaps even skeptical. They were worried that Jobs was completely rolling him. They had hired Scully to control Jobs, and now it was clear that Jobs was the one in control. Scully was so eager for Steve's approval that he was unable to stand up to him, Rock recalled. Keeping Jobs happy and deferring to his expertise may have seemed like a smart strategy to Scully. But he failed to realize that it was not in Jobs' nature to share control. Deference did not come naturally to him. He began to become more vocal about how he thought the company should be run. At the 1984 business strategy meeting, for example, he pushed to make the company's centralized sales and marketing staffs bid on the right to provide their services to the various product divisions. This would have meant, for example, that the Macintosh Group could decide not to use Apple's marketing team and instead create one of its own. No one else was in favor, but Jobs kept trying to ram it through. People were looking to me to take control, to get him to sit down and shut up, but I didn't, Scully recalled. As the meeting broke up, he heard someone whisper, why doesn't Scully shut him up? When Jobs decided to build a state-of-the-art factory in Fremont to manufacture the Macintosh, his aesthetic passions and controlling nature kicked into high gear. He wanted the machinery to be painted in bright hues, like the Apple logo, but he spent so much time going over paint chips that Apple's manufacturing director, Matt Carter, finally just installed them in their usual beige and gray. When Jobs took a tour, he ordered that the machines be repainted in the bright colors he wanted. Carter objected. This was precision equipment, and repainting the machines could cause problems. He turned out to be right. One of the most expensive machines, which got painted bright blue, ended up not working properly and was dubbed Steve's Folly. Finally Carter quit. It took so much energy to fight him, and it was usually over something so pointless that finally I had enough, he recalled. Jobs tapped as a replacement Debbie Coleman, the spunky but good-natured Macintosh financial officer who had once won the team's annual award for the person who best stood up to Jobs. But she knew how to cater to his whims when necessary. When Apple's art director, Clement Mock, informed her that Jobs wanted the walls to be pure white, she protested, you can't paint a factory pure white. There's going to be dust and stuff all over. Mock replied, there's no white that's too white for Steve. She ended up going along. With its pure white walls and its bright blue, yellow, and red machines, the factory floor looked like an Alexander Calder showcase, said Coleman. When asked about his obsessive concern over the look of the factory, Jobs said it was a way to ensure a passion for perfection. I'd go out to the factory, and I'd put on a white glove to check for dust. I'd find it everywhere, on machines, on the tops of the racks, on the floor. And I'd ask Debbie to get it cleaned. I told her I thought we should be able to eat off the floor of the factory. Well, this drove Debbie up the wall. She didn't understand why. And I couldn't articulate it back then. See, I'd been very influenced by what I'd seen in Japan. Part of what I greatly admired there, and part of what we were lacking in our factory, was a sense of teamwork and discipline. If we didn't have the discipline to keep that place spotless, then we weren't going to have the discipline to keep all these machines running. One Sunday morning Jobs brought his father to see the factory. Paul Jobs had always been fastidious about making sure that his craftsmanship was exacting and his tools in order, and his son was proud to show that he could do the same. Coleman came along to give the tour. Steve was, beaming, she recalled. He was so proud to show his father this creation. Jobs explained how everything worked, and his father seemed truly admiring. He kept looking at his father, who touched everything and loved how clean and perfect everything looked. Things were not quite as sweet when Danielle Mitterrand toured the factory. The Cuba-admiring wife of France's socialist president François Mitterrand asked a lot of questions, through her translator, about the working conditions, while Jobs, who had grabbed Alain Rossmann to serve as his translator, kept trying to explain the advanced robotics and technology. After Jobs talked about the just-in-time production schedules, she asked about overtime pay. He was annoyed, so he described how automation helped him keep down labor costs, a subject he knew would not delight her. Is it hard work? She asked. How much vacation time do they get? Jobs couldn't contain himself. If she's so interested in their welfare, he said to her translator, tell her she can come work here any time. The translator turned pale and said nothing. After a moment Rossmann stepped in to say, in French, Jobs says he thanks you for your visit and your interest in the factory. Neither Jobs nor Madame Mitterrand knew what happened, Rossmann recalled, but her translator looked very relieved. Afterward, as he sped his Mercedes down the freeway toward Cupertino, Jobs fumed to Rossmann about Madame Mitterrand's attitude. At one point he was going just over 100 miles per hour when a policeman stopped him and began writing a ticket. After a few minutes, as the officer scribbled away, Jobs honked. Excuse me, the policeman said. Jobs replied, I'm in a hurry. Amazingly, the officer didn't get mad. He simply finished writing the ticket and warned that if Jobs was caught going over 55 again he would be sent to jail. As soon as the policeman left, Jobs got back on the road and accelerated to 100. He absolutely believed that the normal rules didn't apply to him, Rossmann marveled. His wife, Joanna Hoffman, saw the same thing when she accompanied Jobs to Europe a few months after the Macintosh was launched. He was just completely obnoxious and thinking he could get away with anything, she recalled. In Paris she had arranged a formal dinner with French software developers, but Jobs suddenly decided he didn't want to go. Instead he shut the car door on Hoffman and told her he was going to see the poster artist Fallen instead. The developers were so pissed off they wouldn't shake our hands, she said. In Italy, he took an instant dislike to Apple's general manager, a soft rotund guy who had come from a conventional business. Jobs told him bluntly that he was not impressed with his team or his sales strategy. You don't deserve to be able to sell the Mac, Jobs said coldly. But that was mild compared to his reaction to the restaurant the hapless manager had chosen. Jobs demanded a vegan meal, but the waiter very elaborately proceeded to dish out a sauce filled with sour cream. Jobs got so nasty that Hoffman had to threaten him. She whispered that if he didn't calm down, she was going to pour her hot coffee on his lap. The most substantive disagreements Jobs had on the European trip concerned sales forecasts. Using his reality distortion field, Jobs was always pushing his team to come up with higher projections. He kept threatening the European managers that he wouldn't give them any allocations unless they projected bigger forecasts. They insisted on being realistic, and Hoffman had to referee. By the end of the trip, my whole body was shaking uncontrollably, Hoffman recalled. It was on this trip that Jobs first got to know Jean-Louis Gasset, Apple's manager in France. Gasset was among the few to stand up successfully to Jobs on the trip. He has his own way with the truth, Gasset later remarked. The only way to deal with him was to outbully him. When Jobs made his usual threat about cutting down on France's allocations if Gasset didn't jack up sales projections, Gasset got angry. I remember grabbing his lapel and telling him to stop, and then he backed down. I used to be an angry man myself. I am a recovering alcoholic. So I could recognize that in Steve. Gassé was impressed, however, at how Jobs could turn on the charm when he wanted to. François Mitterrand had been preaching the gospel of informatique pour tous, computing for all, and various academic experts in technology, such as Marvin Minsky and Nicolas Negroponte, came over to sing in the choir. Jobs gave a talk to the group at the Hotel Bristol and painted a picture of how France could move ahead if it put computers in all of its schools. Paris also brought out the romantic in him. Both Gassé and Negroponte tell tales of him pining over women while there. Falling after the burst of excitement that accompanied the release of Macintosh, its sales began to taper off in the second half of 1984. The problem was a fundamental one. It was a dazzling but woefully slow and underpowered computer, and no amount of hoopla could mask that. Its beauty was that its user interface looked like a sunny playroom rather than a somber dark screen with sickly green pulsating letters and surly command lines. But that led to its greatest weakness. A character on a text-based display took less than a byte of code, whereas when the Mac drew a letter, pixel by pixel in any elegant font you wanted, it required 20 or 30 times more memory. The Lisa handled this by shipping with more than 1000K RAM, whereas the Macintosh made do with 128K. Another problem was the lack of an internal hard disk drive. Jobs had called Joanna Hoffman a Xerox bigot when she fought for such a storage device. He insisted that the Macintosh have just one floppy disk drive. If you wanted to copy data, you could end up with a new form of tennis elbow from having to swap floppy disks in and out of the single drive. In addition, the Macintosh lacked a fan, another example of Jobs's dogmatic stubbornness. Fans, he felt, detracted from the calm of a computer. This caused many component failures and earned the Macintosh the nickname, the beige toaster, which did not enhance its popularity. It was so seductive that it had sold well enough for the first few months, but when people became more aware of its limitations, sales fell. As Hoffman later lamented, the reality distortion field can serve as a spur, but then reality itself hits. At the end of 1984, with Lisa sales virtually non-existent and Macintosh sales falling below 10,000 a month, Jobs made a shoddy, and atypical, decision out of desperation. He decided to take the inventory of unsold Lisas, graft on a Macintosh emulation program, and sell them as a new product, the Macintosh XL. Since the Lisa had been discontinued and would not be restarted, it was an unusual instance of Jobs producing something that he did not believe in. I was furious because the Mac XL wasn't real, said Hoffman. It was just to blow the excess Lisas out the door. It sold well, and then we had to discontinue the horrible hoax, so I resigned. The dark mood was evident in the ad that was developed in January 1985, which was supposed to reprise the anti-IBM sentiment of the resonant, 1984, ad. Unfortunately there was a fundamental difference. The first ad had ended on a heroic, optimistic note, but the storyboards presented by Lee Clow and Jay Chiat for the new ad, titled Lemmings, showed dark-suited, blindfolded corporate managers marching off a cliff to their death. From the beginning both Jobs and Scully were uneasy. It didn't seem as if it would convey a positive or glorious image of Apple, but instead would merely insult every manager who had bought an IBM. Jobs and Scully asked for other ideas, but the agency folks pushed back. You guys didn't want to run. 1984. Last year, one of them said. According to Scully, Lee Clow added, I will put my whole reputation, everything, on this commercial. When the filmed version, done by Ridley Scott's brother Tony, came in, the concept looked even worse. The mindless managers marching off the cliff were singing a funeral-paced version of the Snow White song, hi-ho, and the dreary filmmaking made it even more depressing than the storyboards portended. I can't believe you're going to insult businesspeople across America by running that, Debbie Coleman yelled at Jobs when she saw the ad. At the marketing meetings, she stood up to make her point about how much she hated it. I literally put a resignation letter on his desk. I wrote it on my Mac. I thought it was an affront to corporate managers. We were just beginning to get a toehold with desktop publishing. Nevertheless, Jobs and Scully bent to the agency's entreaties and ran the commercial during the Super Bowl. They went to the game together at Stanford Stadium with Scully's wife, Lisa, who couldn't stand Jobs, and Jobs' new girlfriend, Tina Reds. When the commercial was shown near the end of the fourth quarter of a dreary game, the fans watched on the overhead screen and had little reaction. Across the country, most of the response was negative. It insulted the very people Apple was trying to reach, the president of a market research firm told Fortune. Apple's marketing manager suggested afterward that the company might want to buy an ad in the Wall Street Journal apologizing. Jay Chiat threatened that if Apple did that his agency would buy the facing page and apologize for the apology. Jobs's discomfort, with both the ad and the situation at Apple in general, was on display when he traveled to New York in January to do another round of one-on-one press interviews. Andy Cunningham, from Regis McKenna's firm, was in charge of hand-holding and logistics at the Carlyle. When Jobs arrived, he told her that his suite needed to be completely redone, even though it was 10 p.m. and the meetings were to begin the next day. The piano was not in the right place, the strawberries were the wrong type. But his biggest objection was that he didn't like the flowers. He wanted calla lilies. We got into a big fight and what a calla lily is, Cunningham recalled. I know what they are, because I had them at my wedding, but he insisted on having a different type of lily and said I was stupid, because I didn't know what a real calla lily was. So Cunningham went out and, this being New York, was able to find a place open at midnight where she could get the lilies he wanted. By the time they got the room rearranged, Jobs started objecting to what she was wearing. That suit's disgusting, he told her. Cunningham knew that at times he just simmered with undirected anger, so she tried to calm him down. Look, I know you're angry, and I know how you feel, she said. You have no fucking idea how I feel, he shot back, no fucking idea what it's like to be me. 30 years old. Turning 30 is a milestone for most people, especially those of the generation that proclaimed it would never trust anyone over that age. To celebrate his own 30th, in February 1985, Jobs threw a lavishly formal but also playful, black tie and tennis shoes, party for 1,000 in the ballroom of the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco. The invitation read, there's an old Hindu saying that goes, in the first 30 years of your life, you make your habits. For the last 30 years of your life, your habits make you. Come help me celebrate mine. One table featured software moguls, including Bill Gates and Mitch Kapor. Another had old friends such as Elizabeth Holmes, who brought as her date a woman dressed in a tuxedo. Andy Hertzfeld and Burrell Smith had rented tuxes and wore floppy tennis shoes, which made it all the more memorable when they danced to the Strauss waltzes played by the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra. Ella Fitzgerald provided the entertainment, as Bob Dylan had declined. She sang mainly from her standard repertoire, though occasionally tailoring a song like, The Girl from Ipanema, to be about the boy from Cupertino. When she asked for some requests, Jobs called out a few. She concluded with a slow rendition of, Happy Birthday. Scully came to the stage to propose a toast to, technology's foremost visionary. Wozniak also came up and presented Jobs with a framed copy of the Zoltaire hoax from the 1977 West Coast Computer Fair, where the Apple II had been introduced. The venture capitalist Don Valentine marveled at the change in the decades since that time. He went from being a Ho Chi Minh look-alike, who said never trust anyone over 30, to a person who gives himself a fabulous 30th birthday with Ella Fitzgerald, he said. Many people had picked out special gifts for a person who was not easy to shop for. Debbie Coleman, for example, found a first edition of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Last Tycoon. But Jobs, in an act that was odd yet not out of character, left all of the gifts in a hotel room. Wozniak and some of the Apple veterans, who did not take to the goat cheese and salmon mousse that was served, met after the party and went out to eat at a Denny's. It's rare that you see an artist in his 30s or 40s able to really contribute something amazing, Jobs said wistfully to the writer David Sheff, who published a long and intimate interview in Playboy the month he turned 30. Of course, there are some people who are innately curious, forever little kids in their awe of life, but they're rare. The interview touched on many subjects, but Jobs's most poignant ruminations were about growing old and facing the future. Your thoughts construct patterns like scaffolding in your mind. You are really etching chemical patterns. In most cases, people get stuck in those patterns, just like grooves in a record, and they never get out of them. I'll always stay connected with Apple. I hope that throughout my life I'll sort of have the thread of my life and the thread of Apple weave in and out of each other, like a tapestry. There may be a few years when I'm not there, but I'll always come back. If you want to live your life in a creative way, as an artist, you have to not look back too much. You have to be willing to take whatever you've done and whoever you were and throw them away. The more the outside world tries to reinforce an image of you, the harder it is to continue to be an artist, which is why a lot of times, artists have to say, bye. I have to go. I'm going crazy and I'm getting out of here. And they go and hibernate somewhere. Maybe later they re-emerge a little differently. With each of those statements, Jobs seemed to have a premonition that his life would soon be changing. Perhaps the thread of his life would indeed weave in and out of the thread of Apple's. Perhaps it was time to throw away some of what he had been. Perhaps it was time to say, bye, I have to go, and then re-emerge later, thinking differently. Exodus Andy Hertzfeld had taken a leave of absence after the Macintosh came out in 1984. He needed to recharge his batteries and get away from his supervisor, Bob Belville, whom he didn't like. One day he learned that Jobs had given out bonuses of up to $50,000 to engineers on the Macintosh team. So he went to Jobs to ask for one. Jobs responded that Belville had decided not to give the bonuses to people who were on leave. Hertzfeld later heard that the decision had actually been made by Jobs, so he confronted him. At first Jobs equivocated, then he said, well, let's assume what you are saying is true. How does that change things? Hertzfeld said that if Jobs was withholding the bonus as a reason for him to come back, then he wouldn't come back as a matter of principle. Jobs relented, but it left Hertzfeld with a bad taste. When his leave was coming to an end, Hertzfeld made an appointment to have dinner with Jobs, and they walked from his office to an Italian restaurant a few blocks away. I really want to return, he told Jobs. But things seem really messed up right now. Jobs was vaguely annoyed and distracted, but Hertzfeld plunged ahead. The software team is completely demoralized and has hardly done a thing for months, and Burrell is so frustrated that he won't last to the end of the year. At that point Jobs cut him off. You don't know what you're talking about, he said. The Macintosh team is doing great, and I'm having the best time of my life right now. You're just completely out of touch. His stare was withering, but he also tried to look amused at Hertzfeld's assessment. If you really believe that, I don't think there's any way that I can come back, Hertzfeld replied glumly. The Mac team that I want to come back to doesn't even exist anymore. The Mac team had to grow up, and so do you, Jobs replied. I want you to come back, but if you don't want to, that's up to you. You don't matter as much as you think you do, anyway. Hertzfeld didn't come back. By early 1985 Burrell Smith was also ready to leave. He had worried that it would be hard to quit if Jobs tried to talk him out of it. The reality distortion field was usually too strong for him to resist. So he plotted with Hertzfeld how he could break free of it. I've got it, he told Hertzfeld one day. I know the perfect way to quit that will nullify the reality distortion field. I'll just walk into Steve's office, pull down my pants, and urinate on his desk. What could he say to that? It's guaranteed to work. The betting on the Mac team was that even brave Burrell Smith would not have the gumption to do that. When he finally decided he had to make his break, around the time of Jobs' birthday bash, he made an appointment to see Jobs. He was surprised to find Jobs smiling broadly when he walked in. Are you gonna do it? Are you really gonna do it? Jobs asked. He had heard about the plan. Smith looked at him. Do I have to? I'll do it if I have to. Jobs gave him a look, and Smith decided it wasn't necessary. So he resigned less dramatically and walked out on good terms. He was quickly followed by another of the great Macintosh engineers, Bruce Horn. When Horn went in to say goodbye, Jobs told him, everything that's wrong with the Mac is your fault. Horn responded, well, actually, Steve, a lot of things that are right with the Mac are my fault, and I had to fight like crazy to get those things in. You're right, admitted Jobs. I'll give you 15,000 shares to stay. When Horn declined the offer, Jobs showed his warmer side. Well, give me a hug, he said. And so they hugged. But the biggest news that month was the departure from Apple, yet again, of its co-founder, Steve Wozniak. Wozniak was then quietly working as a mid-level engineer in the Apple II division, serving as a humble mascot of the roots of the company and staying as far away from management and corporate politics as he could. He felt, with justification, that Jobs was not appreciative of the Apple II, which remained the cash cow of the company and accounted for 70% of its sales at Christmas 1984. People in the Apple II group were being treated as very unimportant by the rest of the company, he later said. This was despite the fact that the Apple II was by far the largest selling product in our company for ages, and would be for years to come. He even roused himself to do something out of character. He picked up the phone one day and called Scully, berating him for lavishing so much attention on Jobs and the Macintosh division. Frustrated, Wozniak decided to leave quietly to start a new company that would make a universal remote control device he had invented. It would control your television, stereo, and other electronic devices with a simple set of buttons that you could easily program. He informed the head of engineering at the Apple II division, but he didn't feel he was important enough to go out of channels and tell Jobs or Markula. So Jobs first heard about it when the news leaked in the Wall Street Journal. In his earnest way, Wozniak had openly answered the reporter's questions when he called. Yes, he said, he felt that Apple had been giving short shrift to the Apple II division. Apple's direction has been horrendously wrong for 5 years, he said. Less than 2 weeks later Wozniak and Jobs traveled together to the White House, where Ronald Reagan presented them with the first National Medal of Technology. The president quoted what President Rutherford Hayes had said when first shown a telephone, an amazing invention, but who would ever want to use one? And then quipped, I thought at the time that he might be mistaken. Because of the awkward situation surrounding Wozniak's departure, Apple did not throw a celebratory dinner. So Jobs and Wozniak went for a walk afterward and ate at a sandwich shop. They chatted amiably, Wozniak recalled, and avoided any discussion of their disagreements. Wozniak wanted to make the parting amicable. It was his style. So he agreed to stay on as a part-time Apple employee at a $20,000 salary and represent the company at events and trade shows. That could have been a graceful way to drift apart. But Jobs could not leave well enough alone. One Saturday, a few weeks after they had visited Washington together, Jobs went to the new Palo Alto studios of Hartmut Esslinger, whose company Frogdesign had moved there to handle its design work for Apple. There he happened to see sketches that the firm had made for Wozniak's new remote control device, and he flew into a rage. Apple had a clause in its contract that gave it the right to bar Frogdesign from working on other computer-related projects, and Jobs invoked it. I informed them, he recalled, that working with Woz wouldn't be acceptable to us. When the Wall Street Journal heard what happened, it got in touch with Wozniak, who, as usual, was open and honest. He said that Jobs was punishing him. Steve Jobs has a hate for me, probably because of the things I said about Apple, he told the reporter. Jobs's action was remarkably petty, but it was also partly caused by the fact that he understood, in ways that others did not, that the look and style of a product served to brand it. A device that had Wozniak's name on it and used the same design language as Apple's products might be mistaken for something that Apple had produced. It's not personal, Jobs told the newspaper, explaining that he wanted to make sure that Wozniak's remote wouldn't look like something made by Apple. We don't want to see our design language used on other products. Woz has to find his own resources. He can't leverage off Apple's resources, we can't treat him specially. Jobs volunteered to pay for the work that Frogdesign had already done for Wozniak, but even so the executives at the firm were taken aback. When Jobs demanded that they send him the drawings done for Wozniak or destroy them, they refused. Jobs had to send them a letter invoking Apple's contractual right. Herbert Pfeiffer, the design director of the firm, risked Jobs's wrath by publicly dismissing his claim that the dispute with Wozniak was not personal. It's a power play, Pfeiffer told the Journal. They have personal problems between them. Hertzfeld was outraged when he heard what Jobs had done. He lived about 12 blocks from Jobs, who sometimes would drop by on his walks. I got so furious about the Wozniak remote episode that when Steve next came over, I wouldn't let him in the house, Hertzfeld recalled. He knew he was wrong, but he tried to rationalize, and maybe in his distorted reality he was able to. Wozniak, always a teddy bear even when annoyed, hired another design firm and even agreed to stay on Apple's retainer as a spokesman. Showdown. Spring 1985. There were many reasons for the rift between Jobs and Scully in the spring of 1985. Some were merely business disagreements, such as Scully's attempt to maximize profits by keeping the Macintosh price high when Jobs wanted to make it more affordable. Others were weirdly psychological and stemmed from the torrid and unlikely infatuation they initially had with each other. Scully had painfully craved Jobs's affection, Jobs had eagerly sought a father figure and mentor, and when the ardor began to cool there was an emotional backwash. But at its core, the growing breach had two fundamental causes, one on each side. For Jobs, the problem was that Scully never became a product person. He didn't make the effort, or show the capacity, to understand the fine points of what they were making. On the contrary, he found Jobs's passion for tiny technical tweaks and design details to be obsessive and counterproductive. He had spent his career selling sodas and snacks whose recipes were largely irrelevant to him. He wasn't naturally passionate about products, which was among the most damning sins that Jobs could imagine. I tried to educate him about the details of engineering, Jobs recalled, but he had no idea how products are created, and after a while it just turned into arguments. But I learned that my perspective was right. Products are everything. He came to see Scully as clueless, and his contempt was exacerbated by Scully's hunger for his affection and delusions that they were very similar. For Scully, the problem was that Jobs, when he was no longer in courtship or manipulative mode, was frequently obnoxious, rude, selfish, and nasty to other people. He found Jobs's boorish behavior as despicable as Jobs found Scully's lack of passion for product details. Scully was kind, caring, and polite to a fault. At one point they were planning to meet with Xerox's vice chair Bill Glavin, and Scully begged Jobs to behave. But as soon as they sat down, Jobs told Glavin, "You guys don't have any clue what you're doing," and the meeting broke up. "I'm sorry, but I couldn't help myself," Jobs told Scully. It was one of many such cases. As Atari's Al Alcorn later observed, Scully believed in keeping people happy and worrying about relationships. Steve didn't give a shit about that. But he did care about the product in a way that Scully never could, and he was able to avoid having too many bozos working at Apple by insulting anyone who wasn't a player. The board became increasingly alarmed at the turmoil, and in early 1985 Arthur Rock and some other disgruntled directors delivered a stern lecture to both. They told Scully that he was supposed to be running the company, and he should start doing so with more authority and less eagerness to be pals with Jobs. They told Jobs that he was supposed to be fixing the mess at the Macintosh division and not telling other divisions how to do their job. Afterward Jobs retreated to his office and typed on his Macintosh, "I will not criticize the rest of the organization, I will not criticize the rest of the organization." Quote. As the Macintosh continued to disappoint, sales in March 1985 were only 10% of the budget forecast. Jobs holed up in his office fuming or wandered the halls berating everyone else for the problems. His mood swings became worse, and so did his abuse of those around him. Middle-level managers began to rise up against him. The marketing chief Mike Murray sought a private meeting with Scully at an industry conference. As they were going up to Scully's hotel room, Jobs spotted them and asked to come along. Murray asked him not to. He told Scully that Jobs was wreaking havoc and had to be removed from managing the Macintosh division. Scully replied that he was not yet resigned to having a showdown with Jobs. Murray later sent a memo directly to Jobs criticizing the way he treated colleagues and denouncing management by character assassination. For a few weeks it seemed as if there might be a solution to the turmoil. Jobs became fascinated by a flat-screen technology developed by a firm near Palo Alto called Woodside Design, run by an eccentric engineer named Steve Kitchen. He also was impressed by another startup that made a touchscreen display that could be controlled by your finger, so you didn't need a mouse. Together these might help fulfill Jobs' vision of creating a Mac in a book. On a walk with Kitchen, Jobs spotted a building in nearby Menlo Park and declared that they should open a skunkworks facility to work on these ideas. It could be called Apple Labs and Jobs could run it, going back to the joy of having a small team and developing a great new product. Scully was thrilled by the possibility. It would solve most of his management issues, moving Jobs back to what he did best and getting rid of his disruptive presence in Cupertino. Scully also had a candidate to replace Jobs as manager of the Macintosh division, Jean-Louis Gasset, Apple's chief in France, who had suffered through Jobs' visit there. Gasset flew to Cupertino and said he would take the job if he got a guarantee that he would run the division rather than work under Jobs. One of the board members, Phil Schlane of Macy's, tried to convince Jobs that he would be better off thinking up new products and inspiring a passionate little team. But after some reflection, Jobs decided that was not the path he wanted. He declined to cede control to Gasset, who wisely went back to Paris to avoid the power clash that was becoming inevitable. For the rest of the spring, Jobs vacillated. There were times when he wanted to assert himself as a corporate manager, even writing a memo urging cost savings by eliminating free beverages and first-class air travel, and other times when he agreed with those who were encouraging him to go off and run a new Apple Labs R&D group. In March, Murray let loose with another memo that he marked, "Do not circulate," but gave to multiple colleagues. In my 3 years at Apple, I've never observed so much confusion, fear, and dysfunction as in the past 90 days, he began. We are perceived by the rank and file as a boat without a rudder, drifting away into foggy oblivion. Murray had been on both sides of the fence. At times he conspired with Jobs to undermine Scully, but in this memo he laid the blame on Jobs. Whether the cause of or because of the dysfunction, Steve Jobs now controls a seemingly impenetrable power base. At the end of that month, Scully finally worked up the nerve to tell Jobs that he should give up running the Macintosh division. He walked over to Jobs' office one evening and brought the human resources manager, Jay Elliott, to make the confrontation more formal. "There is no one who admires your brilliance and vision more than I do," Scully began. He had uttered such flatteries before, but this time it was clear that there would be a brutal, but, punctuating the thought. And there was. "But this is really not going to work," he declared. The flatteries punctured by buts continued. "We have developed a great friendship with each other," he said, "but I have lost confidence in your ability to run the Macintosh division." He also berated Jobs for badmouthing him as a bozo behind his back. Jobs looked stunned and countered with an odd challenge, that Scully should help and coach him more. "You've got to spend more time with me." Then he lashed back. He told Scully he knew nothing about computers, was doing a terrible job running the company, and had disappointed Jobs ever since coming to Apple. Then he began to cry. Scully sat there biting his fingernails. "I'm going to bring this up with the board," Scully declared. "I'm going to recommend that you step down from your operating position of running the Macintosh division. I want you to know that." He urged Jobs not to resist and to agree instead to work on developing new technologies and products. Jobs jumped from his seat and turned his intense stare on Scully. "I don't believe you're going to do that," he said. "If you do that, you're going to destroy the company." Over the next few weeks Jobs' behavior fluctuated wildly. At one moment he would be talking about going off to run Apple Labs, but in the next moment he would be enlisting support to have Scully ousted. He would reach out to Scully, then lash out at him behind his back, sometimes on the same night. One night at 9 he called Apple's general counsel Al Eisenstadt to say he was losing confidence in Scully and needed his help convincing the board to fire him. At 11 the same night, he phoned Scully to say, "You're terrific, and I just want you to know I love working with you." At the board meeting on April 11, Scully officially reported that he wanted to ask Jobs to step down as the head of the Macintosh division and focus instead on new product development. Arthur Rock, the most crusty and independent of the board members, then spoke. He was fed up with both of them, with Scully for not having the guts to take command over the past year, and with Jobs for acting like a petulant brat. The board needed to get this dispute behind them, and to do so it should meet privately with each of them. Scully left the room so that Jobs could present first. Jobs insisted that Scully was the problem because he had no understanding of computers. Rock responded by berating Jobs. In his growling voice, he said that Jobs had been behaving foolishly for a year and had no right to be managing a division. Even Jobs' strongest supporter, Phil Schlane, tried to talk him into stepping aside gracefully to run a research lab for the company. When it was Scully's turn to meet privately with the board, he gave an ultimatum: "You can back me, and then I take responsibility for running the company, or we can do nothing, and you're going to have to find yourselves a new CEO." If given the authority, he said, he would not move abruptly,